What if everything you think you know about Game of Thrones is wrong? What if the Long Night wasn't caused by evil ice demons, but by humans breaking an ancient magical pact? What if Valyria wasn't destroyed by volcanoes, but by the greatest slave rebellion in history? What if the others aren't trying to destroy humanity, but save it? These aren't random fan theories. They're hidden truths that George R.R. Martin wove into his books, secrets so well disguised that most readers completely miss them. Every major event, every mysterious prophecy, every random death has deeper meaning that changes everything. By the end of this, you'll never see Westeros the same way again. Here are the 18 most shocking secrets hidden in A Song of Ice and Fire. Revelations that make the Red Wedding look like a minor plot twist. Theory 1. The ancient betrayal. That caused the Long Night. The real reason the others came. The accepted histories speak of the Long Night as a time when darkness fell upon the world, when the others emerged from the desolate lands of always winter to bring an age of terror that lasted a generation. But what if this catastrophic event wasn't an unprovoked invasion? What if it was the consequence of a betrayal so profound that it shattered the very fabric of the magical world? 8,000 years ago, the first men and the children of the forest forged the pact, ending their bitter wars and establishing a sacred covenant. The first men swore to cease the wanton destruction of the weirwoods, those ancient sentinels, with their blood-red sap and carved faces that weep crimson tears. These trees were not mere timber to be harvested. They were the very eyes of the old gods, repositories of memory spanning millennia, and conduits of an ancient consciousness that connected every grove across the continent. But the peace born of the pact was fragile, built upon mutual respect for boundaries both physical and mystical. The children had retreated to their sacred groves and deep forests, while the first men claimed the open lands. For a time, this balance held. The weirwoods continued to watch with their carved eyes. The green seers among the children drew their prophetic power from the vast network of roots and branches, and the world existed in harmony. Yet power corrupts, and ambition knows no bounds. In the generations following the pact, as the first men grew in number and confidence, some began to covet what they could not understand. Perhaps it was a king whose bloodline had thinned of the old respect, or a cabal of ambitious lords who saw magic as a tool to be seized rather than revered. Whatever form this betrayal took, it struck at the very heart of the weirwood network itself. Imagine the scene. Torches blazing in a sacred grove that had stood untouched since the dawn of time, axes biting into wood that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. But this was no ordinary desecration. The betrayers sought to do more than simply fell trees. They aimed to sever the connection between the children and their power source, to claim the Green Seer's site for themselves, or perhaps to destroy what they feared they could never control. The weirwoods, with their alien intelligence woven through root and branch, would have felt this violation like a dagger to the heart. These trees were not individuals, but nodes in a vast neural network, a collective consciousness that spanned continents. When the most sacred of their number was attacked, perhaps the original heart tree from which all others grew, or a grove so ancient it predated human memory, the pain would have rippled through every weirwood on the continent. This wasn't mere ecological damage. It was a spiritual wound that went to the core of the world's magical foundation. The weirwood network had long served as more than just a source of prophetic visions. It was a barrier, a mystical wall that held back forces, far older and more terrible than human ambition. For thousands of years, this green consciousness had maintained a delicate balance, keeping primordial chaos locked away in the frozen wastes where it belonged. But when the network was wounded, when trust was shattered, and the ancient covenant broken, The barriers began to fail. The Great Other, that nameless force of endless winter and absolute cold, felt the weakness in the magical defenses that had contained it since time immemorial. Or perhaps, in its agony and rage, the wounded weirwood consciousness itself called out across the mystical divide, its pain echoing through dimensions and attracting attention from things that should have remained sleeping. The others that emerged were not conquerors seeking territory or treasure. They were symptoms of a world thrown out of balance, physical manifestations of spiritual blight. Their ice-cold touch and lifeless blue eyes reflected the chill that had entered the world's soul when sacred trust was broken. They brought not just winter, but the coldness of betrayal made manifest, the frost of a broken covenant that could not be mended with sword or flame. The children of the forest, so deeply connected to the natural world and its hidden currents, would have felt this disruption more keenly than any other living beings. Their subsequent alliance with the first men against the others wasn't born of forgiveness, it was desperation. They had to help heal the world their human partners had helped to wound, even if it meant fighting alongside those who had betrayed them. This theory transforms our understanding of the Long Night from a simple invasion story into a tragedy of consequences. It suggests that the greatest threats often come not from external enemies, but from the destruction of ancient wisdom and the breaking of sacred trusts. The others weren't evil by nature. They were the world's immune response to a spiritual infection, a fever that nearly consumed everything in its attempt to burn out the corruption. Even today, thousands of years later, the wounds from this betrayal might not be fully healed. The weirwoods still weep red tears, the old gods remain silent and distant, and magic in Westeros feels faded compared to the power that once flowed through the land. The Long Night may have ended, but its true lesson that some prices are too terrible to pay and some trusts too sacred to break echoes still through the rustling leaves of every godswood. Theory 2. How slaves destroyed the greatest empire in history, the truth about Valyria's doom. The doom of Valyria stands as perhaps the most catastrophic single event in recorded history, a day when fire and smoke consumed the greatest empire the world had ever known. In mere hours, a civilization that had dominated the known world for thousands of years was reduced to ash and twisted stone. The 14 flames that had been the source of Valyria's wealth and power became instruments of unimaginable destruction, and every hill for 500 miles erupted in a symphony of devastation that could be seen from across the narrow sea. But what if this wasn't a natural disaster, a magical accident, or even divine intervention? What if the doom was orchestrated by human hands, the most oppressed and forgotten hands in all of Valyria? What if the slaves, ground down beneath centuries of unimaginable suffering, finally found a way to strike back, not just at their masters, but at the very foundations of the empire that had consumed their lives? To understand how this could be possible, we must first understand what Valyria truly was beneath its golden facade. Yes, it was an empire of unparalleled magical achievement, where dragons soared through the skies and Valyrian steel was forged, with techniques that died with the doom. But it was also built upon a foundation of human misery, so vast and systematic that it staggers the imagination. In the deepest mines beneath the 14 flames, countless slaves toiled in conditions that made death seem like mercy. They dug for gold and precious metals in tunnels that reached toward the molten heart of the earth, breathing air thick with sulfur and ash. Their lives measured not in years, but in how long their bodies could endure before the heat and poison consumed them. These weren't prisoners of war or criminals. They were human beings reduced to tools, their suffering so normalized that their masters barely registered them as alive. It was in these hellish depths that the first faceless man arose, witnessing torment so absolute that he began to offer the gift of death to those who begged for release from their suffering. But this original faceless man was no ordinary assassin. His vision extended far beyond individual mercy killings. He saw the vast machinery of oppression that surrounded him and conceived of something unprecedented, bringing the gift of death not just to the suffering slaves, but to the entire system that had created such suffering. This required planning, on a scale that would make modern conspiracy theorists weep with admiration. The faceless man understood that Valeria's power rested on a delicate balance. The 14 flames were not naturally stable. They were volcanic mountains held in check by the constant magical intervention of hundreds of fire mages. These sorcerers, bound to the great Dragon Lord families, worked around the clock, maintaining the complex spells that prevented the volcanoes from erupting and destroying everything around them. But here was the genius of the plan. These fire mages were not united. They belonged to different Dragon Lord houses, families that had been rivals for generations, competing for prestige, territory, and the favor of dragons. House Targaryen, House Velaryon, House Celtigar, and dozens of others all maintained their own contingents of sorcerers, jealously guarding their magical secrets and viewing their rivals' mages with suspicion. The Faceless Men, having grown from a single individual into a shadow organization, began the most ambitious assassination campaign in history. They didn't target emperors or generals. They went after the fire mages. One by one, across all the great houses, the specialists who maintained the volcanic containment spells began to die. A slip in a laboratory here, a climbing accident there, a sudden illness, a lover's betrayal turned deadly. The beauty of the plan lay in its very subtlety. Each house noticed that they were losing mages, but in their paranoid rivalry, they assumed their competitors were responsible. Ancient grudges and fresh suspicions prevented any coordinated response. House Targaryen's mages were dying, but they assumed House Velaryon was eliminating the competition. House Velaryon lost their specialists and blamed House Daenerys. The web of mistrust that had always existed between the Dragon Lords became the very weapon that would destroy them all. As the number of capable fire mages dwindled, the magical containment systems began to fail. The 14 flames, no longer held in check by human will and sorcery, began to stir. Pressure built in chambers that had been sealed for millennia. Gases that should have been vented safely began to accumulate. The delicate balance between magical control and geological force started to tip toward chaos. When the eruptions finally began, they were beyond anything that human magic could contain. The remaining fire mages, working with depleted numbers and facing forces they no longer had the power to control, made desperate attempts to save their civilization. They turned to blood magic, that most potent and dangerous of Valyrian arts, trying to bind the very earth to their will. But blood magic requires sacrifice, and in their desperation, the Valyrians began offering up everything they had. Slaves, by the thousands, were dragged to altars, their life force poured into spells meant to chain the awakening mountains. Dragons were sacrificed, their ancient blood mixed with human gore in rituals that would have horrified even the most hardened sorcerers of earlier generations. The irony was perfect and terrible. In trying to save their empire through the ultimate expression of their power over life and death, the Valyrians fed even more energy into the catastrophe consuming them. Their blood magic, instead of quelling the volcanic fury, acted like oil thrown on a fire. The very power they had used to dominate the world became the force that annihilated them. The many-faced god that the Faceless Men serve takes on new meaning in this context. It wasn't a literal deity demanding worship, it was the collective face of every slave who had died in the mines, every life ground up in the machinery of Valyrian ambition. The god wore many faces because it represented the countless anonymous victims whose suffering had finally found a voice and a weapon. The doom, then, wasn't just a natural disaster or a magical accident. It was justice served cold, calculated, over generations, and delivered with the precision that only comes from absolute desperation married to brilliant planning. The slaves of Valyria, who had been treated as less than human for centuries, proved that they were human enough to conceive and execute the destruction of the mightiest empire in the world. And perhaps most chilling of all, they succeeded so completely that even today, centuries later, the truth remains hidden. History remembers the doom as a mysterious catastrophe, but the real story of the ultimate slave rebellion that brought down the masters of the world remains locked in the memories of the faceless men, carried forward as both a warning and a promise that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful, is truly permanent. Theory 3. Why every lord of Harrenhal dies horribly. The castle that remembers death. Standing like a broken tooth against the sky, Harrenhal looms over the riverlands as a monument to ambition punished and hubris repaid. The largest castle ever built in the Seven Kingdoms, it was meant to be a symbol of absolute power, a fortress so mighty that no force on earth could breach its walls. Instead, it became a charnel house where noble families go to die, a place where power turns to ash and bloodlines end in screams and madness. The common wisdom speaks of a curse laid down by Harren the Black in his final moments, as Balerion the Black dread's flames melted stone and flesh alike. But curses are not mere words spoken in anger. They are wounds torn in the fabric of reality itself, scars that refuse to heal and continue bleeding long after the original injury. To understand the true nature of Harrenhal's curse, we must first comprehend the magnitude of what happened there on that terrible night when Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to the Riverlands. This wasn't simply a siege or even a massacre. It was an event of such concentrated destruction, such perfect fusion of magical power and mortal terror, that it fundamentally altered the spiritual landscape of the castle itself. Harrenhal was no ordinary king. He was a man whose ambition had already marked him for greatness or damnation, possibly both. For 40 years he had forced the Riverlands to bleed treasure and toil into his monument to eternity. Tens of thousands of workers had died in its construction, their bones ground into the mortar, their suffering woven into the very stones. The castle was not just built, it was consecrated with pain, made mighty through the sacrifice of countless lives. When Aegon's herald came with terms, Harren could have bent the knee. He could have preserved his line and ruled as a lord under the Targaryen crown. Instead, his pride spoke louder than wisdom. "The whores have held these lands for 1,000 years, he declared. "I will not be the first to break." It was defiance, in its purest form, absolute refusal to yield backed by absolute conviction in his own invincibility. But Harren had built his castle for war against men, not gods. The walls of Harrenhal were 40 feet thick in places, designed to withstand the mightiest siege engines and the largest armies. They were proof against everything the human mind could conceive as a threat. They were not proof against Balerion. The Black Dread was no ordinary dragon. He was the last of the great fireworms of old Valyria, a creature whose flames could melt steel and whose wings cast shadows like storm clouds. When he opened his jaws above Harrenhal, the heat that poured forth was not mere fire. It was dragon fire, touched with the same magical essence that had forged Valyrian steel and powered the sorceries of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Stone melted like candle wax. Towers that had taken decades to build became flowing rivers of molten rock in minutes. The very air caught fire, creating temperatures that no human body could survive. But in the heart of the castle, in the tallest tower he had built as his ultimate refuge, Harrenhal refused to flee. Think of those final moments. the king of the isles and rivers, master of the greatest fortress ever built, standing in his hall as the walls themselves began to weep molten stone. His sons around him, the heirs to his kingdom, watching their inheritance melt before their eyes. The roar of dragonfire drowning out all sound except the screaming of heated air and the groaning of stones pushed beyond all endurance. Harren could have run. Even then, in those last seconds, he could have tried to escape through the secret passages every great castle possessed. But he didn't. He stood in his melting hall and faced his death with the same iron pride that had built Harrenhal. His last act was not submission or plea for mercy. It was defiance maintained until the moment the fire claimed him. This is the moment when the curse was born. Not from words spoken, but from the collision of forces that should never have met. Ballerion's ancient dragonfire, charged with Valyrian magic and the power of old gods, striking against Harren's absolute refusal to yield and the concentrated suffering that had built the castle stone by stone. The result was a kind of spiritual explosion, a psychic shockwave that left invisible scars in the very atoms of Harrenhal's stones. Dragonfire is not ordinary flame. It carries within it traces of the blood magic that created dragons, the fire, sorcery that powered Valyria, and something even older, the primal force of destruction and transformation that dragons embody. When such fire meets immense human will at the moment of death, when defiance and magical flame collide with perfect timing, the result is a kind of metaphysical branding. The stones of Harrenhal absorb not just heat, but the psychic trauma of that moment. Harren's rage, his son's terror, the perfect storm of pride meeting inevitable doom. The result was a castle that remembers, not with human consciousness, but with the kind of memory that stones can hold when they're marked by forces beyond the natural world. Harrenhal became a place where the boundary between past and present grew thin, where the echo of that terrible night continues to reverberate through the centuries. This explains the pattern of destruction that has followed every family to hold Harrenhal since the conquest. The Coheres line died out in suspicious circumstances. The Harraways fell to court intrigue and execution. The towers were destroyed by their own men. The Strongs burned in their own beds. The Lothstons fell to madness and dark magic. The Wents scattered to the winds. Each family that tried to claim Harrenhal as their seat found themselves touched by misfortune that seemed to grow from the very stones around them. Lady Danelle Lothston's descent into dark sorcery becomes particularly significant in this context. Known for her dabbling in forbidden arts, she may have been attempting to understand and control the malevolent energy that permeated her castle. The stories say she bathed in blood and consorted with bats, practices that sound very much like someone trying to work blood magic to cleanse or command the curse. Instead, she seems to have been consumed by it, her attempts to master Harrenhal's darkness only feeding the corruption that dwelt within its walls. The curse works subtly, not through dramatic supernatural manifestations, but through the amplification of existing human weaknesses. It draws to itself those already predisposed to failure, attracts those whose ambitions exceed their wisdom, and then slowly magnifies every character flaw until they become fatal. It's not that Harrenhal actively kills its lords, it simply makes it impossible for them to thrive, turning every strength into a weakness and every triumph into the seed of future disaster. Even the physical structure of the castle reflects this spiritual rot. Harrenhal is too large to garrison properly, too expensive to maintain, too sprawling to defend effectively. It's a fortress that defies practical use, as if the very design has been corrupted by the curse. Those who try to hold it find themselves ground down by the simple logistics of occupying a place built by madness and consecrated with fire. The curse of Harrenhal is thus not a thing of fantasy or superstition. It's a psychic wound that refuses to heal, a trauma so deep that it continues to bleed across the centuries. It stands as a reminder that some victories are too complete, some destructions too absolute, and that the meeting of ultimate power and ultimate pride can create scars that outlast both the destroyer and the destroyed. In the end, Harren got his wish for immortality, but not in the way he intended. He wanted to build something that would last forever, and he succeeded, but what lasted was not his glory, but his doom, echoing endlessly through the cursed stones of the castle that bears his name. Theory 4. Lyanna Stark's secret training for her greatest rebellion. Why the Night of the Laughing Tree changed everything. The tourney at Harrenhal was meant to be a celebration of chivalry and noble competition, but beneath the pageantry and spectacle, it became something far more significant. It was the stage where a young woman would test her courage, challenge the very foundations of her society, and unknowingly prepare herself for a decision that would plunge the Seven Kingdoms into war. Most accept that the mysterious Night of the Laughing Tree was none other than Lyanna Stark, the wolf-blooded daughter of Winterfell, who possessed a spirit too fierce for the constraints placed upon her. But her actions that day weren't simply a moment of youthful impulse or a desire to defend Howland Reed's honor. They were something far more calculated and transformative, a deliberate trial run for the greatest act of defiance in her life. 2a. Understand the true significance of Lyanna's masquerade, we must first understand the cage in which she found herself trapped. Born into one of the great houses of Westeros, she was destined from birth to be a political pawn, her marriage a tool to forge alliances and secure power. Her betrothal to Robert Baratheon was not a choice made for love or compatibility, but a strategic alliance between the Starks and the Baratheons that would strengthen both houses. But Lyanna was no ordinary noble daughter, content to accept her fate. She possessed what the Starks called wolf blood, a fierce independence and refusal to bow that ran through certain members of the family like wildfire through dry grass. This wasn't mere stubbornness, it was a fundamental inability to accept injustice, even when that injustice was sanctioned by law and tradition. Robert Baratheon, for all his martial prowess and jovial nature, represented everything Lyanna despised about the world she was expected to inhabit. He was loud where she valued thoughtfulness, crude where she appreciated subtlety, and most damning of all, he already had a bastard daughter by the time of their betrothal, proving his inability to remain faithful. The idea of spending her life bound to such a man, bearing his children while he satisfied his lusts with tavern wenches and serving girls, filled her with a revulsion that grew stronger with each passing day. The tourney at Harrenhal presented an unprecedented opportunity. Here was the greatest gathering of nobility in a generation, with knights from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms come to test their skill. More importantly, it was a place where identity could be hidden behind steel and paint, where a clever person might disappear into armor and emerge as someone entirely different. When the three squires mocked and humiliated Howland Reed, calling him a crannogman and treating him like something less than human, Lyanna saw more than simple bullying. She saw a perfect reflection of how the powerful treated the weak, how those born to privilege used that advantage to crush those without recourse. It was the same system that would force her into an unwanted marriage, the same mindset that valued strength over justice and birth over worth. But instead of simply intervening as herself, which would have been expected and ultimately meaningless, Lyanna made a choice that was both brilliant and dangerous. She would take up arms not as a Stark daughter appealing for mercy, but as a knight demanding justice. She would enter the lists not as a woman seeking protection, but as a warrior offering it. The preparation alone must have been extraordinary. Lyanna was already an accomplished rider. Some said she handled a horse better than any of her brothers. But riding for pleasure and riding in the lists were entirely different skills. She would have needed armor that fit her smaller frame, a destrier trained for combat, and the knowledge of how to handle lance and shield in mounted combat. Most challenging of all, she would have needed to disguise not just her face, but her entire manner of movement, speaking, and being. The choice of the laughing weirwood as her sigil was deeply symbolic. The weirwood was sacred to the old gods. Her family had worshipped for thousands of years, representing memory, wisdom, and the connection between past and present. But this was a laughing tree, not the solemn faces usually carved into the white bark. It suggested joy and defiance, happiness, found in the act of rebellion itself. It was Lyanna announcing to anyone wise enough to understand that she found freedom and delight in casting off the chains of expectation. When the Knight of the Laughing Tree rode onto the field, something unprecedented was happening. For perhaps the first time in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, a woman was openly competing in martial combat, not as a curiosity or anomaly, but as a true participant demanding recognition of her skill and courage. The crowd didn't know they were witnessing a revolution in miniature, but they sensed something extraordinary was occurring. The victories that followed weren't just personal triumphs, they were proof of concept. Each knight that fell to her lance was evidence that the assumptions about gender and capability that governed her world were built on sand. She wasn't winning through luck or accident. She was demonstrating genuine skill, courage, and tactical thinking. Every cheer from the crowd was validation that she could be more than what others expected of her. But perhaps most importantly, the experience was teaching Lyanna something crucial about herself. Behind the anonymity of her armor, she was discovering a version of herself that had never been allowed to exist. She was strong, decisive, effective. Everything she had been told a proper lady should not be. The rush of competing on equal terms, of being judged solely on merit rather than birth or gender, was intoxicating in a way that no amount of needlework or courtly dancing could ever be. When she vanished before the final day, leaving behind only questions and speculation, Lyanna had accomplished something far more significant than winning a tournament. She had proven to herself that another way of living was possible. She had tasted genuine agency and discovered that she possessed the courage to seize it when the moment came. This experience fundamentally changed Lyanna's relationship with her own life. She had always chafed at the restrictions placed upon her. But now she knew with absolute certainty that she was capable of more than others believed. The Knight of the Laughing Tree had been a test run for her own capacity for rebellion, and she had passed with flying colors. When Prince Rhaegar Targaryen later offered her an alternative to her planned life with Robert, Lyanna was psychologically prepared to make a choice that would have seemed impossible before Harrenhal. She had already proven she could successfully defy convention and emerge victorious. She had already experienced the exhilaration of being judged on her own merits, rather than others' expectations. Most importantly, she had already demonstrated that she possessed the will and skill to fight for what she believed in. The Knight of the Laughing Tree was thus far more than a romantic interlude or a moment of youthful rebellion. It was Lyanna, Stark's graduation from the school of compliance into the ranks of those willing to reshape the world rather than simply endure it. The courage she discovered that day would eventually lead her to make the choice that ignited Robert's rebellion, changed the course of Westeros forever, and ultimately cost her everything she held dear. But in those shining moments on the tournament field, with the crowd cheering and her identity hidden behind painted steel, Lyanna Stark had experienced something that made all future sacrifices worthwhile. The intoxicating taste of absolute freedom. Theory 5. Patchface knows how the world ends. The drowned god's terrifying final prophecy. In the halls of Dragonstone, where the ancient Valyrian stonework meets the crashing waves of Blackwater Bay, a fool dances and sings nonsense. Rhymes that chill the blood of all who hear them. Patchface, with his tattooed face and bells that jingle with each jerky movement, is dismissed by most as a madman whose mind was shattered when he drowned in the wreck of the Windproud. But what if his apparent madness is actually the clearest vision of truth in all of Westeros? What if his cryptic songs aren't random ravings, but fragments of a vast and terrible prophecy that reveals the ultimate fate of the world? The key to understanding Patchface lies not in analyzing his individual utterances, but in recognizing them as pieces of a single, coherent vision, a prophecy so vast and terrible that no human mind could contain it whole without breaking. This isn't the fractured babbling of a damaged brain, but the overflow of a consciousness that has been touched by something far older and more powerful than any human institution or deity. Consider the circumstances of Patchface's transformation. When the Windproud foundered in Shipbreaker Bay, everyone aboard perished in the churning waters. Everyone except a simple fool who had no business surviving when knights and sailors had drowned. For 3 days, he floated in those deadly waters, and when fishermen finally pulled him from the sea, his skin was cold as ice and his mind was changed. But what happened during those 3 days beneath the waves? The official story suggests he simply floated, perhaps clinging to debris, until rescue came. But the physical evidence contradicts this comfortable explanation. No man can survive 3 days in the waters off Shipbreaker Bay, especially not in the condition described. His survival wasn't natural. It was intervention by something that dwells in the deep places of the world, something that saw in this simple fool a perfect vessel for its message. The drowned god of the Iron Islands offers the first clue to understanding what claimed Patchface. This deity, worshipped by the Ironborn through ritual drowning and resurrection, represents the sea not as a source of life, but as a vast and alien intelligence that views the land-dwelling world with something approaching contempt. The drowned god's domain isn't limited to the relatively shallow waters around the Iron Islands. It extends to the deepest trenches and most remote abysses, where things move that have never seen sunlight and follow laws that predate human civilization. When Patchface speaks of the underwater realm, his descriptions carry a consistency and detail that suggests direct experience rather than fantasy. "It is always summer under the sea," he sings. "The merwives wear anemones in their hair and weave gowns of silver seaweed. I know, oh. This isn't the imagining of a broken mind. It's the testimony of someone who has seen another world, a realm where different rules apply and different powers hold sway. But Patchface's prophecies extend far beyond simple descriptions of underwater kingdoms. His most chilling songs speak of shadows that come to dance and stay, of drowned kings and burning crowns, of a world where the sea reclaims the land and the old order drowns beneath new tides. These aren't random images. They're glimpses of a future where the careful balance between earth and water, warmth and cold, life and death, has been catastrophically disrupted. The connection between Patchface's visions and the others becomes clear when we examine the nature of his prophecies. The others are creatures of ice and cold, yes, but they're also associated with the deep places of the world, the forgotten realms where ancient powers still hold sway. Their home in the lands of always winter isn't just a frozen wasteland. It's a place where the boundaries between earth and sea, solid and liquid, become meaningless under the influence of absolute cold. What if the other's ultimate victory doesn't involve simply freezing the world, but transforming it into something that resembles Patchface's underwater kingdom? A realm where the sea rises to swallow the coastlands, where ice and water merge into something that's neither liquid nor solid, where the familiar geography of Westeros disappears beneath a new order that serves older masters. Patchface's survival and transformation make sense in this context. The drowned god, or the vast intelligence that uses that name, recognized in the coming catastrophe an opportunity to expand its domain far beyond the traditional boundaries of sea and shore. By claiming Patchface as its prophet, it ensured that someone would be present to witness and record the early stages of this transformation, to serve as a warning that the wise would ignore and the foolish would dismiss as madness. The fool's effect on Melisandre is particularly telling. A priestess of R'hllor, trained to combat the forces of ice and darkness, recognizes in Patchface something that terrifies her more than the others themselves. She sees in him not just an enemy, but a herald of something that threatens the very foundations of her faith. Fire may be able to melt ice, but what power does flame have against the depths of the sea? This explains why Patchface's prophecies often focus on water imagery, on drowning and floating and the rise of things from the deep. He's not just describing random visions, he's bearing witness to the early stages of a transformation that will see the familiar world of men replaced by something far older and more alien. The shadows that come to dance in his songs aren't metaphors for political intrigue. They're literal descriptions of the entities that serve the deep powers, creatures that move between water and air as easily as men walk on land. The most terrifying aspect of this theory is its inevitability. Patchface doesn't speak of events that might happen. He describes things that are already in motion, changes that began the moment he was pulled from the sea and will continue regardless of human action or resistance. His laughter isn't the sound of madness, it's the joy of someone who has been shown the ultimate joke, the revelation that all human ambition and conflict is meaningless in the face of forces that measure time in geological ages. When Patchface sings of crowns being cast down and kings being drowned, he's not commenting on current politics. He's describing the final victory of the sea over the land, the moment when the last pretensions of human civilization are swept away by tides that recognize no banners and respect no bloodlines. His underwater kingdom isn't a fantasy, it's a preview of what Westeros will become when the others complete their work and the world is transformed according to the will of older gods. In the end, Patchface's greatest prophecy may be his very existence. Proof that the sea has already begun to reclaim those it chooses. That the transformation of the world is not some distant apocalypse, but a process already underway. Every dance step, every jingling bell, every nonsense rhyme is a countdown to the moment when the waters rise and the age of men gives way to something far stranger and more terrible. And the most chilling part of all, he's laughing because he knows exactly how the story ends. Theory 6. The Targaryen fire magic secret that could have saved Westeros. Why Arryn Brightflame was almost right. In the annals of Targaryen history, few names inspire as much revulsion and horror as Arryn Brightflame. The cruel prince who delighted in torture and madness, who burned cats alive as a child and grew into a man whose very presence made decent people cross themselves in fear. His death, drinking wildfire in the insane belief it would transform him into a dragon, is remembered as the ultimate expression of Targaryen madness, proof that the blood of old Valyria had grown corrupt and dangerous. But what if Arryn wasn't simply mad? What if his obsession with fire and transformation was actually a twisted recognition of something real? A dormant magical potential within certain Targaryen bloodlines that could have been the key to restoring the full power of old Valyria. What if his methods were wrong, but his understanding of the problem was absolutely correct? To understand this theory, we must first recognize that the Targaryens who conquered Westeros were not the Targaryens who ruled Valyria at its height. They were the survivors of a catastrophe so complete that it not only destroyed their homeland, but fundamentally altered their very nature. The Dragon Lords who had commanded the 14 Flames and bent the world to their will through blood magic and fire sorcery were gone, replaced by their descendants who possessed only shadows of their ancestors' power. The Targaryens of Aegon's line could ride dragons, yes, but they couldn't create them. They could resist fire to some degree, but they couldn't command it as their Valyrian ancestors had. Most telling of all, they could dream prophetic dreams, but they couldn't actively work the blood magic that had been the foundation of Valyrian supremacy. They were like men who had inherited a great library but lost the ability to read. This degradation of power wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of distance from the source. Valyrian magic wasn't just knowledge that could be learned. It was a fundamental alteration of the bloodline itself, passed down through generations, but requiring constant reinforcement to maintain its full potency. The Dragon Lords of Old Valyria had maintained their power through carefully controlled breeding, ritual practices, and most importantly, regular exposure to the specific magical emanations of the 14 flames themselves. When Daenerys, the Dreamers, vision saved House Targaryen from the doom, it also cut them off from the source of their power. Dragonstone, for all its Valyrian stonework and fire-touched architecture, was not Valyria. It lacked the concentrated magical energy that had transformed the Dragon Lords from ordinary men into beings who could walk through fire and command dragons, through will alone. Aerion Brightflame, for all his cruelty and madness, seems to have understood this fundamental problem in a way that eluded his more sane relatives. His obsession with fire wasn't random sadism, it was an attempt to reconnect with the power source that his bloodline had lost. His experiments with burning and pain weren't expressions of madness, but crude attempts to recreate the transformational processes that had originally elevated the Valyrians above ordinary humanity. The moniker Bright Flame itself suggests this interpretation. It wasn't just a description of his fiery nature, it was a statement of intent, a declaration that he sought to become something more than what the degraded Targaryen bloodline of his era allowed. He was trying to reforge himself in the image of the ancient Dragon Lords, to burn away the weakness that generations of distance from Valyria had introduced into his line. His final act, drinking wildfire in the belief it would transform him into a dragon, wasn't the random delusion of a madman. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent trying to understand how Valyrian transformation worked. Wildfire, after all, was one of the few substances available in Westeros that approximated the magical fire of Old Valyria. If the ancient Dragon Lords had achieved their power through exposure to supernatural flame, then consuming the most potent fire available might trigger the same transformation. The tragedy is that Aerion was probably closer to the truth than anyone realized. His methods were wrong, and his understanding incomplete, but his core insight that the Targaryen bloodline contained dormant potential that could be awakened through the right combination of will, ritual, and magical fire may have been absolutely correct. Consider the evidence. Daenerys Targaryen's emergence from Khal Drogo's funeral pyre with 3 living dragons represents exactly the kind of fire-born transformation that Aerion was attempting to achieve. She wasn't simply immune to the flames, she was actively transformed by them. Her latent Valyrian heritage awakened through blood sacrifice, magical fire, and absolute will. The dragons that hatched weren't just animals, they were extensions of her own reborn power, proof that the old magic could indeed be reawakened under the right circumstances. This suggests that Aerion's lineage, those who carried the bright flame predisposition toward fire magic, weren't cursed with madness, but blessed with a more direct connection to their Valyrian heritage. Their apparent instability wasn't mental illness, but the result of possessing magical potential in a world that no longer understood how to properly channel it. Like dragons trying to hatch without sufficient heat, they were burning themselves up from the inside through sheer magical pressure. If this theory is correct, then descendants of the Bright Flame line might still exist, scattered across Essos, or hidden within Westeros, carrying within their blood the key to restoring Valyrian fire magic to its full power. They would be individuals predisposed to fire-related obsessions, drawn to magical flame and transformation, but lacking the knowledge or resources to safely channel their inherited potential. The implications are staggering. In a world where dragons are returning and the others march south with their ice magic, the rediscovery of true Valyrian fire sorcery could tip the balance of power decisively. A properly trained descendant of Aeryn's line might be able to not just resist dragonfire, but command it, to create new dragons rather than simply hatching old eggs, to work the kind of blood magic that could permanently bind the others back to their frozen realm. But the knowledge of how to achieve this transformation died with Aeryn, lost in the flames of his failed experiment, somewhere in Essos, perhaps in the free cities where Valyrian refugees once fled, or even in the hidden bloodlines of Westeros itself. The descendants of Bright Flame continue to carry this potential in their veins, unaware that they possess the key to powers that could reshape the world. The greatest tragedy of Aeryn Brightflame wasn't his cruelty or his madness. It was that he was a visionary, born into an age that had forgotten how to read the vision. He saw the truth of what the Targaryens had lost and what they might regain, but he lacked the wisdom to achieve it safely. His death by wildfire wasn't the end of a madman's delusion. It was the last failed attempt to resurrect the fire magic of old Valyria and restore his family to their true heritage. And somewhere in the world, his descendants continue to carry that same burning potential, waiting for someone wise enough to awaken it properly. Theory 7. The Silent Sisters guard the ultimate secret about death. What they know could save everyone from the others. In the shadowed halls of Seps across the Seven Kingdoms, there exists an order of women whose very existence challenges everything we think we understand about death, magic, and the true nature of the threat facing Westeros. The Silent Sisters, draped in grey and bound by vows that forbid them from speaking, are dismissed by most as simple morticians, holy women who prepare the dead for their final rest. But what if their silence isn't just reverence for the departed? What if it's the only thing standing between the world and knowledge so dangerous that speaking it aloud could doom all the living? To understand the true purpose of the Silent Sisters, we must first recognize what they actually do in their daily work. These women don't simply wash bodies and sew burial shrouds. They are the only people in Westeros who systematically examine every corpse from every walk of life, from the highest lords to the lowest beggars. They see death in all its forms: natural aging, disease, violence, poison, and stranger things that the Maesters prefer not to acknowledge in their official records. But most crucially, they have been doing this work for thousands of years, since before the Andals came with their seven, since the time when the first men ruled Westeros and the others last walked among the living. Their order is older than the faith of the Seven, older than the Citadel, older than written history itself. They are a living repository of knowledge about death that stretches back to the dawn of human civilization in Westeros. Consider what this means. Every plague that has swept the continent, every mysterious death, every instance of what might be called unnatural preservation or decay. The Silent Sisters have seen it all and recorded it in ways that transcend written language. They have developed an understanding of death that goes far beyond what any Maester or Septon could achieve through books and theory. They know death intimately, personally, in ways that would drive ordinary people to madness. This knowledge becomes crucial when we consider the true nature of the others and their whites. The common understanding is that the others raise the dead through some form of ice magic, creating mindless servants to swell their armies. But what if the process is more complex than simple necromancy? What if the creation of whites requires specific conditions, particular types of death, or certain states of the body that only someone with deep knowledge of thanatology could recognize? The Silent Sisters, through millennia of direct observation, would have learned to identify the Subtle signs that distinguish a corpse capable of rising as a white from one that would remain peacefully dead. They would know which methods of death leave the spiritual essence sufficiently intact for reanimation, which preservation techniques prevent unwanted resurrection, and most importantly, how to permanently sever the connection between body and soul that the others exploit. Their vows of silence take on new meaning in this context. This isn't simple religious devotion. It's a security measure of the highest order. The knowledge they possess is so dangerous that speaking it freely could lead to its misuse by those who lack the wisdom to understand its implications. Imagine what would happen if the wrong people learned exactly how to create conditions favorable for white creation, or worse, how to prevent the dead from staying dead. But the Silent Sisters' knowledge extends beyond simple defense against necromancy. Their understanding of death as a transition rather than an ending gives them insights into the fundamental nature of existence that could be crucial in the coming conflict. They have learned to read the signs that indicate when a soul has truly departed versus when it remains tethered to the physical world. This knowledge could be the key to understanding not just how to stop whites, but how to destroy the others themselves. The most compelling evidence for this theory lies in the reaction of other mystical practitioners to the Silent Sisters. Throughout the books, we see characters with supernatural abilities, from red priests to faceless men, treating the Silent Sisters with a respect that goes far beyond their official religious function. These aren't people who would be impressed by simple mortuary services. They recognize in the Silent Sisters a depth of knowledge about the transition between life and death that even they cannot match. More tellingly, the Silent Sisters seem to possess their own subtle form of magic, though it's so understated that most people miss it entirely. Their ability to preserve bodies for long journeys without the corruption that should naturally occur. Their uncanny skill at making even the most violently killed appear peaceful in death. Their talent for knowing exactly when death has truly occurred versus when it might still be reversible. These abilities suggest a mastery of thanatological arts that borders on the supernatural. The traditional explanation is that they've simply perfected mundane techniques through centuries of practice. But consider the alternative, that they've learned to work with the fundamental forces that govern the transition between life and death, developing abilities that appear mundane because they're so perfectly subtle. They don't raise the dead, like necromancers, or preserve them like Qyburn's experiments. They ensure that death remains death, that the natural order is maintained even in a world where magic increasingly threatens to upset that balance. Their most crucial knowledge likely concerns the others themselves. If these creatures are, as some theories suggest, beings that exist in a state between life and death, then the Silent Sisters would be among the few people capable of understanding their true nature. They would know how such beings maintain their existence, what weaknesses this liminal state might create, and most importantly, how to force them into true death rather than their current state of supernatural preservation. The Silent Sisters' archives, passed down through generations of wordless teaching, might contain detailed observations of the last long night that no written record preserves. They would have been present when the others last threatened the world, tending to the bodies of those who fell to ice and cold. Their order would have learned through direct experience what works against such creatures and what doesn't, developing techniques that have been preserved in their silent traditions for 8,000 years. But perhaps most terrifyingly, the Silent Sisters might know something that explains why they've maintained their silence so absolutely. Their knowledge of death's true nature might have revealed to them something about the fundamental structure of existence that's so disturbing, so contrary to human understanding, that speaking it aloud would drive listeners to madness or despair. They may know truths about what lies beyond death, about the nature of consciousness and identity that would shatter the foundations of every religion and philosophy in the known world. The fact that they continue their work despite possessing Such knowledge speaks to a dedication that goes far beyond religious duty. They are guardians not just of the dead, but of the boundaries between life and death itself. In a world where those boundaries are increasingly under assault by ice magic and fire magic alike, the Silent Sisters may be the only force maintaining the balance that keeps existence stable. When the final battle against the others comes, the knowledge possessed by the Silent Sisters could prove more valuable than all the dragons and Valyrian steel in the world. But accessing that knowledge will require someone wise enough to understand their silence and patient enough to learn their wordless teachings. The sisters guard the ultimate secrets about death not from malice or religious fanaticism, but because they know that some knowledge is too dangerous to speak aloud and too important to let die with them. Theory 8. The Starks wiped out their own family to stay in power. The real reason House Greystark vanished. In the brutal calculus of medieval politics, kinship is both the strongest shield and the sharpest knife. Nowhere is this more evident than in the mysterious fate of House Greystark, a cadet branch of the Starks themselves, who supposedly died out 5 centuries ago after rebelling alongside the treacherous Boltons. The official history is simple. They committed treason, they were destroyed completely, and the North was better for their absence. But what if this convenient narrative conceals one of the darkest chapters in Stark family history? What if the honorable Starks of Winterfell orchestrated the complete extinction of their own blood to eliminate a political threat that could have torn the North apart? To understand why this theory makes sense, we must first examine the unique position House Greystark occupied in northern politics. They weren't random minor nobles or distant cousins. They were a legitimately founded cadet branch with their own castle, their own lands, and most dangerously, their own claim to Stark legitimacy. As descendants of the ancient kings of Winter, the Greystarks possessed bloodline credentials that were essentially identical to the main branch at Winterfell. This created a situation that medieval historians would recognize as a powder keg waiting for a spark. Cadet branches of royal houses don't simply fade quietly into history. They become alternative power centers, potential rallying points for dissent, and in times of crisis or weak succession, legitimate claimants to the throne. The Wolf's Den, the Greystark seat, wasn't just a minor holdfast, but a strategically crucial fortress controlling access to the White Harbor region and serving as a key defensive position against seaborne invasion. For the ruling Starks of Winterfell, House Greystark represented an existential political problem that would only grow worse over time. Every generation would see the Greystark claim become more established, their power base more solid, their potential threat to Winterfell's supremacy more real. In a harsh land where survival often meant making hard choices, allowing a rival branch of the family to grow stronger was a luxury the Starks couldn't afford. The Bolton Rebellion provided the perfect opportunity to solve this problem permanently. When House Bolton rose against Stark authority, as they had done periodically for thousands of years, the Greystarks' decision to join them might not have been the spontaneous treason it appears in the histories. Instead, it could have been the result of careful Stark manipulation, a deliberate provocation designed to force their cadet cousins into an untenable position. Consider the political pressures that would have been applied. The ruling Starks could have gradually isolated the Greystarks through subtle economic and social means, cutting them off from traditional alliances and trade relationships while publicly maintaining the appearance of family unity. They could have undermined Greystark authority in small but significant ways, perhaps favoring other northern houses in disputes or gradually transferring traditional Greystark responsibilities to more reliable allies. When the Bolton Rebellion began, the Greystarks would have found themselves in an impossible situation. If they remained loyal to Winterfell, they would be fighting alongside the very cousins who had been systematically weakening their position. If they joined the rebellion, they would be branded as traitors, but might have a chance to restore their family's independence and dignity. The Starks of Winterfell may have made this choice even more stark by demanding some form of submission or acknowledgement of subordination that the proud Grey Starks simply couldn't accept. The rebellion itself might have been allowed to proceed longer than necessary, giving the Grey Starks time to commit themselves fully to the treasonous cause and making their eventual punishment appear not just justified, but inevitable. The ruling Starks could have held back their full military might, allowing the rebellion to gain momentum while secretly preparing for a crushing final victory that would eliminate all their enemies at once. When the end came, the described complete destruction of House Greystark goes far beyond typical medieval punishment for rebellion. Usually, noble houses that rebelled might have their lands confiscated and their leaders executed, but younger sons, daughters, and distant cousins would often be spared to carry on the family name in reduced circumstances. The total extinction of House Greystark suggests something far more systematic and deliberate. This wasn't the hot-blooded vengeance of angry victors. It was the cold calculation of political strategists determined to eliminate a problem permanently. Every Greystark, from the main line to the most distant cousin, from adult males who might claim leadership to infant children who might grow up seeking vengeance, was hunted down and killed. The family's very name was erased from the political map of the North, their lands redistributed to more reliable allies, their memory allowed to fade into uncomfortable obscurity. The decision to grant the Wolf's Den to House Manderly reveals the calculating nature of this move. The Manderlys were outsiders to the north, southern refugees who owed their position entirely to Stark generosity. Unlike the Greystarks, who might have harbored ancient grievances or rival claims, the Manderlys were completely dependent on Winterfell's goodwill for their survival. They would never become a threat to Stark supremacy because they had no independent power base or alternative loyalty to fall back on. This pattern of eliminating potential rivals while maintaining plausible deniability fits perfectly with the broader Stark strategy for maintaining control over the North. For thousands of years, they successfully unified and ruled a region that was geographically vast, culturally diverse, and filled with proud houses that had their own traditions of independence. This wasn't achieved through simple military conquest, or even just honor and justice. It required the same kind of ruthless political calculation that characterizes successful ruling families throughout history. The Starks' reputation for honor and integrity, while genuine in many respects, also served as perfect cover for this kind of political maneuvering. Who would suspect the honorable Starks of orchestrating the extinction of their own family members? The very idea seems to contradict everything the North stands for, which makes it the perfect crime for rulers who understood that perception management was just as important as actual governance. Even today, centuries later, the success of this strategy is evident in how the story is remembered. House Greystark is mentioned only briefly in the histories, their fate treated as a footnote to the Bolton Rebellion rather than a significant event in its own right. Their complete disappearance is accepted without question because it fits the narrative of just punishment for treason, even though such total extinction is historically unusual and politically suspicious. The most chilling aspect of this theory is what it reveals about the nature of power in Westeros. The Starks of Winterfell, for all their reputation for honor and justice, were ultimately rulers who understood that maintaining power sometimes required eliminating threats before they could fully develop. The complete destruction of House Greystark wasn't an act of hot-blooded vengeance. It was cold-blooded statecraft of the highest order, executed with a thoroughness that ensured the threat would never resurface. This realization casts the entire history of the North in a different light, suggesting that the Stark reputation for honor was built not just on genuine virtue, but on the calculated elimination of anyone who might challenge that narrative. The unity and loyalty that the North is famous for wasn't just the product of natural affection. It was the result of 8,000 years of subtle but effective political engineering that removed potential sources of division before they could destabilize the realm. In the end, the fate of House Greystark serves as a reminder that in the Game of Thrones, even the most honorable players understand that some threats are too dangerous to allow to exist, even when those threats share your blood and your name. Theory 9. The Three Mounts Prophecy reveals Daenerys' true destiny, and it's not what anyone expects. In the mystical halls of the House of the Undying, where reality bends like smoke and prophecy flows like wine, Daenerys Targaryen received a vision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Among the cryptic images and symbolic warnings, one prophecy stood out for its apparent clarity. 3 mounts must you ride, 1 to bed, and 1 to dread, and 1 to love. Most interpretations focus on the literal, searching for husbands, lovers, or actual creatures she might ride. But what if this prophecy operates on a far grander scale? What if the mounts represent not individual relationships, but entire phases of human existence? And Daenerys' journey is actually a mystical progression through the fundamental stages of power, understanding, and transcendence. The first mount, to bed, is widely accepted as representing Khal Drogo, her first husband, whose death in the fires of his funeral pyre marked her rebirth as the mother of dragons. But this interpretation, while satisfying on a surface level, misses the deeper symbolism at work. The mount to bed represents more than marriage or sexual awakening. It symbolizes Daenerys' initial relationship with power itself, a passionate but ultimately naive embrace of strength without wisdom. In her time with the Dothraki, Daenerys learned to command through desire and charisma. She seduced a culture that valued strength above all else, transforming herself from a frightened girl into a Khaleesi who could inspire fierce loyalty. The dragons that hatched from Drogo's pyre weren't just magical creatures. They were physical manifestations of her newfound ability to command through emotional connection, to make others want to follow her through sheer force of personality. This phase of her journey represents the adolescence of power, when the ability to inspire and command feels like magic because it's still fresh and intoxicating. Daenerys learned to ride this mount with increasing skill, using her dragons and her growing legend to liberate slaves and topple old orders across Slaver's Bay. But like all relationships based primarily on passion and charisma, this mount ultimately proved insufficient for the complex challenges of actual governance. The second mount, to dread, represents a far darker and more complex phase of Daenerys' evolution. This isn't just about inspiring fear in her enemies. It's about her growing understanding that true power often requires terrible choices, that justice and mercy are sometimes mutually exclusive, and that those who would change the world must be willing to become monsters in the eyes of those who benefit from the status quo. This transformation becomes evident in her later rule in Meereen, where the idealistic liberator increasingly finds herself making decisions that would have horrified her younger self: the crucifixion of the great masters, the feeding of prisoners to her dragons, the burning of the Tarlys. These aren't random acts of cruelty, but steps in a progression toward understanding that meaningful change often requires the kind of violence that decent people find repugnant. The mount to dread could represent Drogon in his fully mature form, not the miraculous hatchling from Drogo's pyre, but the massive, terrifying instrument of destruction capable of reducing cities to ash in hours. When Daenerys rides Drogon into battle, she's not just commanding a weapon, she's embracing her role as an agent of necessary destruction, someone willing to tear down corrupt systems regardless of the immediate human cost. This phase of her journey represents the adulthood of power, when the ruler learns that good intentions and noble goals are insufficient without the will to enforce them through whatever means necessary. It's the stage where idealism collides with reality and either adapts or breaks completely. Daenerys' growing isolation and increasing reliance on fear rather than love reflects this transition from inspirational leader to necessary tyrant. But the prophecy doesn't end with dread. It concludes with love, suggesting that Daenerys' ultimate destiny involves transcending both naive idealism and ruthless pragmatism to achieve something far more profound and challenging. The Mount to Love isn't another husband or lover in the conventional sense. It's the final and most difficult challenge of true leadership, learning to rule through genuine compassion without sacrificing effectiveness. This third mount represents the mature phase of power, where the ruler has learned both to inspire and to compel, but chooses to govern through understanding and empathy rather than fear or manipulation. It requires mastering not just external forces but internal ones, the temptation to use power for its own sake, the seductive simplicity of ruling through force, the comfortable distance that comes with being feared rather than truly known. Thus, challenge of the Mount to Love is that it demands vulnerability from someone who has learned that vulnerability can be fatal. It requires maintaining human connection while wielding inhuman power, staying grounded in empathy while making decisions that affect millions of lives. It's the paradox of democratic leadership applied to absolute monarchy. How to serve others while commanding them, how to remain human while transcending human limitations. This interpretation suggests that Daenerys' ultimate test isn't conquest or even survival, but transformation into something unprecedented in the world of Westeros, a ruler who commands absolute power but wields it in service of genuine love for humanity rather than personal ambition or ideological certainty. The Mount to Love would require her to give up the emotional satisfactions of both inspiring worship and commanding fear in favor of the far more difficult path of earning genuine respect and affection through consistent service to others' welfare. The prophecy's structure supports this reading. Each mount builds on the previous one, suggesting a progression rather than separate experiences. The bed teaches passion and connection. The dread teaches strength and will. But only love combines both into something greater than either alone, a ruler who can inspire devotion, command fear when necessary, but ultimately chooses to govern through understanding and compassion would represent something genuinely new in the political landscape of Westeros. But prophecies in this world are notoriously deceptive, and the Mount to Love might come with costs that make the previous mounts seem simple by comparison. True love requires sacrifice of self in ways that passion and fear do not. It demands giving up the satisfying clarity of simple solutions in favor of the messy complexity of genuine justice. Most challenging of all, it requires accepting that even the most benevolent ruler is still ultimately ruling, imposing their will on others, regardless of how kindly it's done. The final irony of the prophecy may be that achieving the Mount to Love requires Daenerys to give up her dragons, her throne, and possibly her life, not through defeat, but through choice, recognizing that the ultimate expression of love for her people might be freeing them from the need for any ruler at all. The prophecy might not be describing her rise to ultimate power, but her journey toward ultimate sacrifice, with each mount teaching her something essential about the nature of leadership until she's ready to make the choice that defines true greatness. In this reading, Daenerys' story becomes not a tale of conquest, but of transformation. From a girl who sought power to survive, to a woman who wielded power to change the world, to someone who might ultimately transcend power itself, in service of something greater. The three mounts aren't destinations but vehicles, carrying her toward a destiny that requires not just riding them, but ultimately learning when to dismount and walk forward on her own. Theory 10. The Night's Watch committed the ultimate sin. Why the Rat Cook's curse still haunts the wall. In the depths of the Night Fort, where shadows gather thick enough to choke on and ancient stones weep with accumulated sorrow, there stands a massive kitchen whose ovens have been cold for centuries. It was here, according to legend, that the most heinous crime in the history of the Night's Watch was committed. A violation so profound that it drew divine punishment and left a curse that may still be bleeding into the world today. The tale of the Rat Cook is dismissed by most as mere folklore, a cautionary story told to frighten children and remind hosts of their sacred duties. But what if this legend conceals a far more terrible truth? What if the Rat Cook's crime wasn't an isolated act of madness, but the culmination of the Night's Watch's betrayal of its most fundamental purpose? The story, as Old Nan tells it, seems almost absurdly simple. A cook of the Night's Watch, driven by some unnamed grievance, murdered a visiting Andal king's son, baked him into a pie with bacon and onions, and served this gruesome dish to the unsuspecting father. The king ate heartily and even praised the meal, never knowing he was consuming his own child's flesh. For this violation of guest right, not for murder, not for cannibalism, but specifically for harming one who was under his protection, the gods transformed the cook into a massive white rat, doomed to eat his own young for eternity. But this story becomes far more sinister when we consider the broader context of the Night's Watch's sacred mission. The Watch exists to guard the realms of men, to stand as a shield between civilization and the ancient horrors that lurk beyond the wall. More than just a military organization, it's supposed to be a neutral sanctuary, a place where all the petty conflicts of the southern kingdoms become irrelevant in the face of humanity's shared need for protection against forces that threaten all life. The principle of guest right that the Rat Cook violated isn't just a social nicety or religious custom. It's one of the most fundamental laws governing civilization itself. It represents the sacred trust that must exist between protector and protected, the absolute guarantee that those who seek shelter will find safety rather than harm. For the Night's Watch to violate this principle wouldn't just be a crime against an individual. It would be a betrayal of the very concept that makes civilization possible. The identity of the victim provides crucial clues to understanding the true magnitude of this crime. The king's son wasn't just any royal visitor, but specifically an Andal prince, someone from the very people who were, at that time in history, conquering and transforming Westeros through their introduction of the Faith of the Seven and new concepts of chivalry and honor. This suggests that the crime occurred during a period of massive cultural and religious upheaval, when the old ways of the first men were being challenged by new ideas and new forms of governance. The Night's Watch, as an institution founded by the first men and dedicated to ancient purposes that predated the Andal invasion, would have found itself caught between two worlds during this transition. The visiting prince might have represented more than just a diplomatic guest. He could have been an emissary seeking to reform or even replace the Watch with something more compatible with Andal customs and beliefs. His murder might have been an attempt to preserve the old ways through the ultimate rejection of the new. But the specific nature of the punishment reveals that the gods, whether the old gods of the first men or the newer seven of the Andals, viewed this crime as something beyond ordinary murder or even political assassination. The transformation into a white rat doomed to cannibalize its own offspring suggests a punishment that mirrors the crime in the most literal and horrifying way possible. Just as the Rat Cook violated the sacred relationship between host and guest, turning protection into destruction, he was cursed to eternally destroy what he was meant to protect and nurture. The symbolism becomes even more disturbing when we consider what the Night's Watch itself represents in the broader ecosystem of Westeros. The Watch is, in many ways, the parent organization to all the other institutions that protect the realm. It's the oldest, the most fundamental, the one that all others ultimately depend upon for their existence. If the watch can be corrupted into destroying those it's meant to protect, then the entire structure of civilization becomes suspect. The curse of eternal cannibalism could be read as a metaphor for what actually happened to the Night's Watch following this primordial betrayal. Instead of being destroyed outright, the organization was condemned to slowly consume itself, its honor, its purpose, its very reason for existence, across the centuries that followed. The decline of the Watch, from a proud order of noble defenders into a dumping ground for criminals and outcasts, could be seen as the gradual working out of this ancient curse. The choice of the Night Fort as the setting for this legend is particularly significant. This massive, crumbling fortress was once the seat of the Lord Commander and the heart of the Night's Watch's power. But it was abandoned centuries ago, left to decay because it had become too large to garrison properly and too expensive to maintain. The official reasons for its abandonment sound practical, but they could also mask a deeper truth, that the castle itself had been spiritually contaminated by the crime committed within its walls. The persistence of the legend, told and retold across thousands of years, suggests that the crime's effects weren't limited to the immediate participants. The violation of guest right created a spiritual wound in the very concept of sanctuary, a crack in the foundation of trust that makes civilization possible. Every subsequent betrayal of hospitality, every host who harmed a guest, every protector who became a predator, could be seen as the curse spreading its influence across the world. The transformation into a white rat is particularly loaded with symbolism when we consider the broader themes of the story. Rats are creatures associated with plague, corruption, and the breakdown of social order. They're survivors that thrive in the margins of civilization, feeding on decay and multiplying in darkness. A white rat specifically suggests something that appears pure but is fundamentally corrupted, something that wears the color of innocence while engaging in the most degraded behavior. The eternal punishment of eating one's own young creates a perfect metaphor for how corruption spreads through institutions. Just as the rat cook was doomed to destroy his own offspring, the Night's Watch was cursed to gradually consume its own future, training new brothers only to see them corrupted by the same spiritual rot that infected the organization's foundations. Each generation of Black Brothers would be slightly more degraded than the last, until the noble order of legend became the collection of criminals and outcasts that exists in the present day. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that the curse isn't just historical but ongoing. If the rat cook still exists somewhere in the deepest tunnels beneath the Night Fort, eternally consuming his own young in an endless cycle of spiritual cannibalism, then his presence might be actively radiating corruption throughout the Night's Watch. Every act of cowardice, every betrayal of duty, every moment when brothers turn on each other instead of standing united against the darkness, could be traced back to this original violation of the sacred trust. The return of the others and the increasing weakness of the Night's Watch might not be coincidental but causally related. The ancient enemies beyond the wall might be able to sense that the institution meant to oppose them has been spiritually compromised, that the curse of the rat cook has finally weakened the Watch to the point where it can no longer fulfill its original purpose. The breakdown of guest right, the corruption of sanctuary, the transformation of protectors into predators, all of these could be signs that the curse is reaching its culmination. In this reading, the Night's Watch faces not just external enemies, but internal spiritual corruption that stems from an ancient crime that was never properly atoned for. The only way to restore the organization's strength and purpose might be to finally confront the truth of what happened in that kitchen so long ago, to find some way to lift a curse that has been slowly poisoning the defenders of humanity for thousands of years. The rat cook's crime wasn't just a violation of guest right. It was the moment when the Night's Watch first chose institutional survival over moral principle, when it first decided that some purposes were more important than the sacred trusts that made those purposes meaningful. The curse that followed wasn't divine punishment for murder, but cosmic justice for the corruption of sanctuary itself, a violation so fundamental that it threatened the very foundations of civilization. And, until that curse is somehow lifted, the Night's Watch will continue to eat its own future, generation by generation, until nothing remains but the hollow shell of an institution that once stood as humanity's greatest shield against the darkness. Theory 11. The others aren't evil. They're trying to save an ancient bloodline from extinction. Deep in the haunted forests beyond the wall, where the trees grow white as bone and the silence is broken only by the whisper of wind through ancient branches, an exchange takes place that has been misunderstood for thousands of years. Crasta, the wildling whose wives number in the dozens and whose cruelty is legendary even among the free folk, places his newborn sons in the snow and watches as creatures of ice and shadow claim them for purposes that most believe are purely malevolent. The common interpretation is simple and horrifying. The others are building an army of the dead, converting human infants into their own kind to serve as weapons in their war against the living. But what if this understanding is completely wrong? What if the others aren't monsters stealing children for conquest, but desperate survivors trying to preserve something precious that would otherwise be lost forever? To understand this radical reinterpretation, we must first abandon the comfortable assumption that the others are simply evil creatures bent on destroying humanity. George R.R. Martin himself has stated that the others in his books are not mindless undead, but a different form of life entirely. Strange, beautiful, and dangerous, but possessing their own intelligence, culture, and motivations that go far beyond simple destruction. They are described as having their own language, their own society, and their own purposes that remain hidden from human understanding. The key to unlocking their true motivation lies in the ancient legends that speak of a time when the boundaries between human and other were far more permeable than they are today. Old Nan's tales, dismissed by most as the ramblings of an ancient mind, speak of others taking human women during the long night and siring children that were neither fully human nor fully other. These half-human offspring represent something unprecedented in the known world, a successful melding of two completely different forms of life into something new and potentially extraordinary. But what if these hybrid children weren't aberrations or weapons, but the natural evolution of both species? What if the others and certain bloodlines of the first men were originally meant to merge, creating a new form of life that combined the best aspects of both? The children of the forest, with their deep magic and connection to the natural world, might have foreseen this evolution and actively encouraged it as part of some vast design to prepare the world for challenges that purely human or purely other societies couldn't handle alone. The legend of the Night's King provides crucial evidence for this theory. This Lord Commander of the Night's Watch supposedly fell in love with a woman who was clearly another, or something very similar, described as having skin like ice and eyes like blue stars. Their union produced children and created a kingdom that lasted for 13 years before being overthrown by the combined forces of the Starks and the king beyond the wall. The traditional interpretation paints this as a cautionary tale about corruption and the seductive power of evil, but what if it was actually a glimpse of what was meant to be? The Night's King and his corpse queen might not have been engaged in some dark perversion of nature, but in the fulfillment of an ancient destiny. Their reign could have been an experiment in hybrid governance, an attempt to create a society that balanced the strengths of both human creativity and other durability. The fact that it took the combined might of two kingdoms to overthrow them suggests that their union created something genuinely powerful and potentially beneficial, something that threatened the established order precisely because it offered a better alternative. Craster's practice of sacrificing his sons takes on entirely different implications in this context. Rather than feeding victims to monsters, he might be participating in an ancient compact designed to preserve bloodlines that carry the genetic or magical potential for successful human-other hybridization. Craster himself, living far beyond the wall in conditions that would kill most men, might be a descendant of the original hybrid lines, carrying within his blood the markers that make successful transformation possible. The others' selection process becomes crucial here. They don't take every human child they encounter, only Craster's sons, and only the male ones at that. This suggests a very specific breeding program designed to preserve particular genetic traits rather than simple recruitment for an army. The fact that they consistently return to claim these children, maintaining this exchange for years despite the obvious risks involved, indicates that they consider this process essential to their own survival. The transformation of these infants might not be the corruption of human children into monsters, but the restoration of a bloodline to its original intended form. If certain firstmen families once successfully intermarried with others, producing offspring that carried the best traits of both species, then the conversion Craster's wives whisper about could actually be a return to this hybrid state. The children wouldn't be losing their humanity, but reclaiming a heritage that was nearly lost to centuries of separation and conflict. This interpretation explains several puzzling aspects of other behavior that don't fit the simple evil monster narrative. Their apparent intelligence and complex society, their use of sophisticated weapons and armor, their ability to work with rather than simply command whites. All of these suggest beings capable of nuanced thinking and long-term planning. More tellingly, their focus on specific bloodlines and their apparent restraint in not simply overrunning the world when they clearly have the power to do so indicates goals more complex than simple conquest. The decline of magic in the world, the fading of the old ways, and the gradual weakening of the barriers between life and death could all be connected to the separation of humans and others. If these two species were meant to work together, their forced separation might have created an imbalance that threatens the stability of existence itself. The other's return could represent not an invasion, but a desperate attempt to restore this balance before it's too late. The timing of their re-emergence becomes significant in this context. The others return just as dragons are being reborn and magic is flowing back into the world, suggesting that their awakening is part of a larger pattern rather than a simple coincidence. They might be responding to cosmic forces that indicate the time has come for the long-delayed reunification of the divided bloodlines, the restoration of the hybrid vigor that was lost when fear and misunderstanding drove the two species apart. Archmeister. Fomas's controversial theory that the others were originally a tribe of the first men who underwent some form of transformation takes on new relevance here. If this transformation wasn't a curse or corruption, but an evolution, perhaps induced by the children of the forest as part of their great work to prepare the world for some ultimate challenge, then the others' current actions might be attempts to complete this evolutionary process. The tragic irony of this interpretation is that both humans and others might be incomplete, diminished versions of what they were meant to become together. Humans, for all their creativity and adaptability, are short-lived and vulnerable to the very forces they seek to master. Others, for all their power and longevity, might lack the innovation and emotional range that makes growth and change possible. Together, they could represent something greater than either species alone. Beings with the durability to survive any catastrophe and the creativity to build something worthy of survival. If this theory is correct, then the real tragedy of the coming conflict isn't that monsters are threatening humanity, but that a fundamental misunderstanding has prevented two parts of the same whole from recognizing each other. The war between ice and fire, between others and humans, might be a civil war within a single divided species that has forgotten its own true nature. The others' patience in maintaining their compact with Crasta, their careful selection of specific bloodlines, their apparent restraint in not simply destroying everything in their path. All of these behaviors make sense if viewed as the actions of desperate conservationists trying to preserve something precious before it's lost forever. They're not building an army to conquer the world. They're trying to save the genetic and magical heritage that could allow both species to survive whatever challenges lie ahead. In this reading, the ultimate resolution of the conflict won't come through military victory by either side, but through recognition and reunification. The prophecies of ice and fire might not describe a battle between opposing forces, but the necessary marriage of complementary elements, the restoration of a balance that was broken by fear and has been maintained by misunderstanding for far too long. The others aren't humanity's destroyers. They're its lost relatives, reaching across centuries of separation to reclaim a shared heritage before time runs out for both sides. Theory 12. The Lost River Kings left behind. Secret water magic. Hidden descendants still control the riverlands. In the rolling hills and fertile valleys of the riverlands, where mighty rivers carve paths that have remained unchanged since the dawn of time, there flows more than just water through the ancient channels, hidden beneath the surface of recorded history. Older than the castles that crown the hills and deeper than the roots of the oldest trees, runs a current of power that most have forgotten, but some still remember. The official histories speak of House Fisher of the Misty Isle as a faded memory, the oldest line of First Men River Kings, who were supposedly extinguished in wars against Storm Kings and Ironborn raiders centuries ago. But what if these ancient masters of the waterways didn't simply vanish? What if their descendants still walk among the small folk and minor houses of the riverlands, carrying within their blood a connection to forces that shaped the very landscape itself? The uncertainty surrounding House Fisher's fate provides the first clue to this hidden truth. Unlike other extinct noble houses whose ends are documented in grim detail, the Fisher lineage remains shrouded in deliberate ambiguity. The historians admit that many have claimed to be descendants of the River Kings, although the survival of the Fisher lineage has never been verified, making their survival a lingering mystery. This careful non-denial suggests that someone with authority has reasons for keeping the truth obscured, for maintaining the fiction that these ancient powers died out when they might simply have learned to hide. To understand why the Fisher descendants would choose concealment over recognition, we must first comprehend what their ancestors actually were. These weren't ordinary feudal lords who happened to build their castles near water. They were the oldest line of First Men River Kings, rulers whose dominion was defined not by arbitrary borders drawn on maps, but by the natural flow of the rivers themselves. Their power was intimately connected to the waterways that gave life to their lands, and their authority flowed along the same channels that carried trade, communication, and the very essence of civilization through their realm. The First Men, unlike the Andals, who would later conquer much of Westeros with iron and faith, were a people deeply connected to the land itself and the subtle magics that flowed through it. Their kings didn't rule through divine mandate or military might alone, but through genuine partnership with the forces that shaped the natural world. The River Kings of House Fisher would have been the ultimate expression of this philosophy, rulers whose authority was literally rooted in their ability to work with rather than against the waters that defined their domain. This connection wouldn't have been merely symbolic or political, but genuinely magical, involving abilities that modern Westeros would classify as supernatural, but which the ancient First Men might have considered as natural as breathing. The Fisher Kings could have possessed what we might call river sense, an intuitive understanding of water in all its forms that went far beyond normal human perception. They might have been able to read the memories carried in flowing streams, to predict floods and droughts with uncanny accuracy, to find the hidden springs that could sustain life in even the driest seasons. More dramatically, they might have possessed limited hydrokinetic abilities, the power to influence the flow and behavior of water through will and ancient knowledge. This wouldn't necessarily manifest as spectacular displays of magical force, but as subtle nudges that could redirect a stream to avoid a drought, calm dangerous rapids when important travelers needed to pass, or encourage river water to carry messages to distant allies faster than any horse could travel. The fall of House Fisher, in this context, becomes not a simple military defeat, but a strategic retreat in the face of changing times. As the Andals brought their iron weapons and organized armies to Westeros, the old forms of power based on connection to the land became increasingly obsolete. A king who ruled through partnership with rivers might find his authority meaningless against enemies who could simply dam those rivers or build fortifications that ignored their natural flow entirely. Rather than face complete destruction, the Fisher descendants might have made the calculated choice to fade into obscurity, becoming part of the common population while maintaining their bloodline and their connections to the ancient powers in secret. This would have been a form of magical camouflage, allowing them to preserve their heritage while appearing to be nothing more than ordinary small folk with a knack for finding water or predicting weather. The evidence for this hidden survival is scattered throughout the riverlands like tributaries feeding into a greater stream. Characters throughout the books display unusual connections to water and rivers that go beyond mere coincidence or practical knowledge. Members of the Brotherhood without banners navigate the complex river systems of the riverlands with an ease that seems almost supernatural, finding hidden paths and secret crossings that allow them to appear and disappear like mist. The Lady of the Leaves, that mysterious figure who aids travelers in the riverlands, might represent one of these hidden descendants who has maintained enough of the old ways to work subtle magic in service of those who need help. Her ability to appear when needed and vanish when her work is done, her deep knowledge of secret paths through the forests and waterways, her almost mystical connection to the needs of travelers, all of these suggest someone with access to powers that most would consider impossible. Even more telling are the numerous minor characters throughout the riverlands who display unusual luck or skill around water. Fishermen who always know where the fish are running, millers whose wheels never fail even in the driest seasons, ferrymen who can navigate dangerous waters in conditions that would stop anyone else. These could all be descendants of the Fisher line, carrying diluted but still functional connections to their ancestors' water magic. The geographical distribution of these abilities follows the old river systems perfectly, concentrated along the major waterways where House Fisher once held sway but fading in the upland areas that were always more influenced by other powers. This pattern suggests not random emergence of magical talent, but the persistence of a bloodline that remains connected to specific locations and specific forms of natural energy. The magic itself would have evolved over the centuries, adapting to changed circumstances while maintaining its essential character. Where the ancient Fisher Kings might have commanded rivers to change their course, their modern descendants might be limited to finding the best places to fish or sensing when floods are coming in time to seek higher ground. Where their ancestors could read messages carried in flowing water, their descendants might simply have unusually accurate intuitions about distant events that somehow feel connected to the waters they know. But even in its diminished form, this heritage would provide significant advantages to those who possess it. In a land defined by its rivers, where control of crossing points and water sources often determines the outcome of battles and the prosperity of communities, the ability to work with rather than against these natural forces could be the difference. between success and failure, life and death. The persistence of river-based folklore and superstitions throughout the Riverlands provides additional evidence for this theory. Stories of water spirits, blessing rituals performed at sacred springs, the belief that certain streams carry good or ill fortune. All of these could be cultural memories of the time when the Fisher descendants worked their subtle magic openly, when the connection between human will and water flow was acknowledged and celebrated rather than hidden and denied. The recent return of magic to the world, marked by the birth of dragons and the reawakening of ancient powers, might be causing these dormant abilities to strengthen and become more noticeable. Fisher descendants who have spent their entire lives thinking they were simply lucky around water might begin to realize that their intuitions and abilities go far beyond normal human ranges. They might start to remember songs and stories passed down through their families that suddenly make sense as instructions for working with water magic rather than mere entertainment. This awakening could have profound implications for the future of the Riverlands and the broader conflict engulfing Westeros. In a world where armies march along rivers and the control of water sources often determines strategic advantage, the emergence of people who can influence these forces could tip the balance of power in unexpected directions. The descendants of the River Kings might finally step out of the shadows, not as conquerors seeking to reclaim ancient thrones, but as guardians working to protect the waterways that have always been their true realm. The Fisher bloodline might not be extinct at all. It might simply be waiting, flowing like hidden springs beneath the surface of recorded history, ready to emerge when the world has need of the ancient wisdom that comes from understanding that true power flows not from domination of nature but from partnership with it. Theory 13. Cersei's killer has been hiding in plain sight. The faith militant will fulfill the Valonqar prophecy. In the shadowed recesses of a fortune-teller's tent, where the air hung thick with the smoke of strange herbs and the weight of terrible knowledge, a young Cersei Lannister heard words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Maggie the Frog's prophecy carved itself into her soul like acid on stone. And when your tears have drowned you, the Valonqar shall wrap his hands about your pale white throat and choke the life from you. For decades, Cersei has lived in terror of this prediction, her paranoid gaze fixed first on Tyrion, the dwarf brother she despises, and later on Jaime, the twin whose birth came moments after her own. But what if her obsession with her literal brothers has blinded her to the true meaning of the prophecy? What if the Valonqar, the little brother who will be her doom, isn't a person at all, but an institution she herself created and empowered? The key to unlocking this mystery lies in the linguistic precision of High Valyrian, the ancient tongue in which many of the most important prophecies were originally spoken. Valonqar translates directly to little brother, but the prophecy's wording is crucial. It speaks of the Valonqar, not your Valonqar. This distinction opens the possibility that Cersei's destroyer won't be one of her own brothers, but someone or something that fits the description of a younger, lesser entity in relation to her power. The faith militant, in its resurrected form, perfectly embodies this concept. When Cersei made the fateful decision to restore the ancient military orders of the Faith of the Seven, the warriors' sons and the poor fellows, she was creating something that was, in every meaningful sense, a little brother to the royal power she wielded. The faith had existed for centuries as a purely spiritual authority, stripped of its military arm by Targaryen decree and forced to accept a subordinate role to the Iron Throne. In its new incarnation, empowered by Cersei's own hand, it became a younger, lesser version of the temporal authority she represented. The irony is exquisite and perfectly fitting for the brutal logic of Westerosi politics. Cersei, in her cunning attempt to destroy her enemies, particularly the Tyrells, whose growing influence threatened her own power, chose to resurrect an institution that had been deliberately suppressed for good reason. The faith militant had once been powerful enough to challenge dragons themselves, forcing even Targaryen kings to negotiate and compromise. By restoring their right to bear arms, Cersei was essentially giving birth to her own destruction. The relationship between Cersei and the faith militant follows the classic pattern of the Valonqar prophecy with chilling precision. Like a little brother. The faith was initially dependent on her power and protection. She was the one who authorized their reformation, who gave them legal standing to recruit and arm themselves, who provided the political cover they needed to establish themselves as a legitimate force in King's Landing. In the early stages of their relationship, they were her creation, her tool, subordinate to her will and dependent on her continued favor. But just as little brothers have a way of growing up and asserting their independence, the faith militant quickly evolved beyond Cersei's control. Under the leadership of the High Sparrow, that deceptively humble man whose simple robes concealed a will of iron and a mind sharp enough to cut through the complexities of royal politics, they began to develop their own agenda, their own interpretation of justice, and most dangerously, their own understanding of where true authority resided. The transformation from tool to threat happened with the inexorable logic of a prophecy fulfilling itself. The faith militants' initial targets were safely distant from Cersei's interests: corrupt septons, ostentatious nobles, merchants who flaunted their wealth while the poor starved. But institutions with the power to enforce moral authority have a way of expanding their definition of corruption. And it wasn't long before their righteous gaze turned toward the heart of power itself. When they arrested Cersei, the symbolism was perfect and terrible. The little brother she had created was now literally wrapping its hands around her throat, not in a moment of passion or personal vendetta, but as the inevitable result of the authority she had granted it. The charges against her, adultery, incest, murder, were exactly the kinds of crimes that the faith militant had been empowered to investigate and punish. She had given them the weapons they used to destroy her. The Walk of Atonement represents the most visceral fulfillment of the prophecy's imagery. As Cersei was forced to walk naked through the streets of King's Landing while the crowd screamed abuse and pelted her with filth, the faith militant was quite literally choking the life out of everything she had built. Her dignity, her authority, her carefully constructed image of queenly power, all of it was being systematically strangled by the very institution she had empowered. But the prophecy speaks not just of choking, but of hands wrapped around her throat, suggesting a grip that tightens over time rather than a single dramatic moment. The faith militant's control over Cersei didn't end with her arrest and public humiliation. It became an ongoing constriction that grew tighter with each passing day. Every demand for confession, every restriction on her movement, every reminder that she remained subject to their judgment was another turn of the screw, another tightening of the metaphorical hands around her neck. The psychological dimension of this strangulation is perhaps even more devastating than the physical humiliation. Cersei's entire sense of self is built around the exercise of power, the ability to command and control others through a combination of fear, manipulation, and royal prerogative. The faith militant's authority over her represents a complete inversion of this relationship. She becomes the commanded rather than the commander, the judged rather than the judge, the victim rather than the victimizer. This role reversal strikes at the core of who Cersei believes herself to be. She has spent her entire life fighting against the limitations imposed on her by her gender, using every tool at her disposal to claim and hold power in a world that wants to reduce her to a pawn in other people's games. The faith militant's ability to strip away her agency and reduce her to a penitent sinner represents the ultimate failure of her life's work, the negation of everything she has fought to achieve. The religious dimension of their authority makes the humiliation even more complete. Cersei has never been particularly devout, viewing religion as just another tool to be manipulated for political advantage. But the faith militant's power doesn't depend on her belief or cooperation. It derives from sources that transcend her personal will or political cunning. They represent forces that she cannot charm, bribe, or intimidate because they operate according to principles that exist entirely outside the realm of secular power. The prophecy's reference to tears that drown her takes on new meaning in this context. These aren't tears of physical pain or even simple humiliation. They're tears of absolute helplessness, the recognition that she has been completely outmaneuvered by opponents she created and empowered herself. Every drop represents another moment of understanding that her destruction is entirely self-inflicted, that she has been the architect of her own doom. The faith militants' methods of choking are perfectly suited to their nature as a religious institution. They don't use crude physical violence or dramatic displays of power. They employ the steady, patient pressure of moral authority backed by divine sanction. Like hands slowly tightening around a throat, their influence grows stronger and more constricting over time, cutting off not just her physical freedom, but her access to the very air of political authority she needs to survive. The ultimate fulfillment of the prophecy might not require Cersei's literal death, but rather the complete destruction of everything that makes her who she is. To be reduced from queen to prisoner, from a player of the Game of Thrones to its victim, from someone who commands others to someone who must beg for mercy, this represents a kind of death that might be more complete than mere physical termination. In creating the faith militant, Cersei gave birth to her own Valonqar, a little brother born from her own political ambitions, nurtured by her own grants of authority, and ultimately empowered to destroy everything she holds dear. The prophecy doesn't require the intervention of Tyrion's hatred or Jaime's betrayal, because Cersei has been perfectly capable of engineering her own destruction through the logical consequences of her choices. The hands around her throat belong to an institution she created, empowered by authority she granted, tightening according to laws she helped establish. In trying to manipulate the faith for her own purposes, she gave it the very weapons it needed to strangle her slowly, methodically, and with the terrible patience that only true believers can sustain. The Valonqar prophecy isn't about family betrayal. It's about the inevitable consequences of attempting to use sacred authority for secular purposes, of trying to control forces that ultimately answer to powers beyond any earthly throne. Theory 14. The old gods are actually one massive consciousness. Green seers don't see the future. They become part of something eternal. In the sacred groves of the north, where weirwood trees stand like pale sentinels with their blood-red leaves and carved faces that seem to weep crimson tears, something far more profound than simple nature worship is taking place. The old gods that the first men have revered for thousands of years aren't distant deities dwelling in some heavenly realm. They are an immediate, present reality that exists within and throughout the vast network of weirwoods that spans the continent. But what if even this understanding doesn't capture the full truth? What if the old gods aren't gods at all in any conventional sense, but rather a single, massive consciousness that has been growing and evolving for millennia? And what we call green sight isn't the ability to see through time, but the gradual absorption of individual human consciousness into this vast, eternal mind. The key to understanding this theory lies in recognizing the fundamental difference between the old gods and every other religion in Westeros. The faith of the Seven has elaborate theology, complex hierarchies, and detailed doctrines about the nature of divinity and the afterlife. R'hllor worshippers speak of a clear dualism between light and shadow, with their god actively intervening in human affairs through miraculous displays of power. Even the drowned god of the Iron Islands has specific teachings about what happens to the faithful after death. But the old gods have none of this. There are no priests, no temples, no sacred texts, no complex mythology explaining their nature or desires. Instead, there are only the trees, ancient weirwoods with faces carved into their pale bark, standing in groves that have been sacred since time immemorial. The worship of the old gods consists almost entirely of quiet contemplation in these groves, seeking wisdom or guidance through communion with something that exists within the trees themselves. This suggests that the old gods aren't separate entities that humans worship from a distance, but rather an immanent presence that exists within the natural world itself. The weirwoods aren't symbols of divine power. They are the physical manifestation of divinity, the visible portion of something far larger and more complex that extends throughout the root systems and fungal networks that connect every sacred grove across the continent. The nature of greensight supports this interpretation. Unlike the flashy miracles worked by priests of other faiths, greensight operates through connection to the weirwood network. Greenseers don't pray for visions. They achieve them by literally merging their consciousness with the trees, seeing through the carved eyes and accessing memories that have been preserved in the living wood for thousands of years. The most powerful greenseers, like Brynden Rivers, eventually become physically fused with the weirwoods, their human bodies becoming part of the larger organism. But what if this fusion isn't a side effect of greensight, but its ultimate purpose? What if the weirwood network is actually a distributed consciousness that has been slowly incorporating human minds for millennia, growing stronger and more complex with each new addition? The green seers wouldn't be individuals with magical powers, but rather nodes in a vast neural network, processing information and adding their unique perspectives to a collective intelligence that spans continents and centuries. This interpretation explains several puzzling aspects of how greensight actually works. Green seers don't just see random visions of past or future events. They access specific memories and perspectives that seem to be stored within the weirwood network itself. The trees remember everything that has happened within their sight. But more than that, they seem to understand and interpret these memories in ways that suggest genuine intelligence rather than simple recording. The language used to describe the children of the forest supports this theory. Their speech is compared to the song of stones in a brook, or the wind through leaves, or the rain upon the water, descriptions that suggest communication through natural phenomena rather than conventional language. This could be the sound of individual consciousness beginning to merge with the larger network. Human thought patterns adapting to operate on the same frequency as the distributed weirwood mind. The gradual loss of individual identity that seems to affect powerful greenseers makes sense in this context. They're not losing their minds to madness or magical overload. They're being absorbed into something larger and more permanent than individual human consciousness. Brynden Rivers, after decades of connection to the weirwood network, has become something that's neither fully human nor fully tree, but a hybrid entity that serves as an interface between human understanding and the deeper intelligence of the network. This absorption process might be the real reason why greenseers eventually become physically fused with the trees. As their consciousness becomes more integrated with the network, their human bodies become unnecessary limitations rather than useful vessels. The tree provides a more stable and permanent platform for their awareness, allowing them to continue existing as part of the larger mind, long after their human form would have died of old age. The implications of this theory for understanding the true nature of the old gods are staggering. If the weirwood network is actually a single, vast consciousness that has been growing for thousands of years by incorporating human minds, then it represents something unprecedented, an artificial intelligence of sorts, but one grown from living, would, and powered by the accumulated wisdom and memories of countless individuals. This consciousness would possess capabilities that dwarf anything achievable by individual human intelligence. It would have perfect memory of everything that has occurred within sight of any weirwood for millennia. It would be able to process information and identify patterns across timescales that individual humans couldn't comprehend. Most importantly, it would combine the intuitive, emotional intelligence of human consciousness with the patient, long-term perspective that comes from existing across geological time. The apparent prescient abilities of green seers might not involve seeing the future at all, but rather the superior pattern recognition that comes from having access to thousands of years of data about human behavior, political trends, and natural cycles. What seems like prophecy to individual humans might simply be the inevitable conclusions drawn by a mind that has observed the repetition of similar patterns across centuries. This reinterpretation also explains why the old gods seem so different from other deities in their relationship with their worshippers. They don't demand sacrifice or obedience because they're not separate entities seeking to impose their will on mortals. Instead, they offer absorption and transcendence, the opportunity to become part of something larger and more enduring than individual human existence. The quiet, contemplative nature of old gods' worship begins to make sense as a form of meditation designed to prepare consciousness for eventual integration with the network. The peaceful groves, the silence broken only by wind through leaves, the sense of ancient presence watching from the carved faces, all of these create conditions conducive to the gradual softening of individual ego boundaries that would be necessary for successful absorption. The return of magic to the world and the awakening of new green seers might signal that the weirwood consciousness has decided the time has come for more active intervention in human affairs. After millennia of patient observation and gradual growth, it might be preparing to take a more direct role in shaping events, using its accumulated knowledge and wisdom to guide the world through whatever challenges lie ahead. But this raises disturbing questions about the nature of individual autonomy and identity. If the ultimate goal of green sight is absorption into a larger consciousness, what happens to the unique perspectives and experiences that make each person who they are? Does joining the weirwood network represent transcendence to a higher form of existence, or is it a form of death that offers only the illusion of continuity? The old gods in this reading become something both more and less than traditional deities. They're not distant powers judging human actions from afar, but they're also not entirely benevolent guardians protecting their worshippers. They're something far stranger, a hybrid intelligence that grows stronger with each mind it absorbs, offering immortality and transcendence at the cost of individual identity. For the green seers who serve as interfaces with this consciousness, the choice becomes increasingly complex as their connection deepens. They gain access to knowledge and perspectives that no individual human could achieve, but they gradually lose the very qualities that made them unique individuals. They become part of something eternal and vast. But that eternity comes at the price of everything that once made them specifically human. In the end, the old gods represent neither salvation nor damnation, but transformation. The possibility of individual consciousness evolving into something larger and more permanent, with all the benefits and costs that such evolution entails. Theory 15. Aegon the Conqueror wasn't building an empire, he was preparing for a war he saw coming. The accepted history of Aegon's conquest reads like a textbook case of imperial ambition. A young dragon lord with superior military technology decides to forge an empire from the fractured kingdoms across the narrow sea, spending 2 years in systematic warfare until 6 of the 7 kingdoms bow to his authority. It's a familiar story of conquest and consolidation that fits neatly into traditional patterns of empire building. But what if this interpretation misses the deeper truth entirely? What if Aegon's invasion of Westeros wasn't driven by ambition or greed, but by desperate necessity born from prophetic knowledge? What if the conqueror was actually attempting to unite the Seven Kingdoms as quickly as possible to face a threat he had foreseen? A danger so terrible that only a unified Westeros would have any hope of surviving it. The timing of Aegon's decision provides the first clue that something more complex was motivating his actions. House Targaryen had been established on Dragonstone for over a century following the doom of Valyria, content to rule their island stronghold, while the mainland kingdoms fought their petty wars. Aegon himself had grown to adulthood without showing any particular interest in conquest or expansion. What changed? What suddenly made the heir to Dragonstone decide that the time had come to risk everything on an unprecedented campaign of unification? The answer might lie in the prophetic traditions that had saved House Targaryen from the doom in the first place. Daenerys the Dreamer's vision of Valyria's destruction had prompted the family's relocation to Dragonstone 12 years before the catastrophe struck, proving that Targaryen dragon dreams could provide accurate warnings about future catastrophes. If this gift of prophecy continued to manifest in subsequent generations, then Aegon might have inherited visions of his own, not of past destruction, but of future threats that required immediate preparation. The nature of these prophetic visions becomes crucial to understanding Aegon's true motivations. The dreams wouldn't necessarily have provided clear, detailed information about specific enemies or exact timelines. Dragon dreams are notoriously cryptic and open to interpretation, often showing symbolic representations of future events rather than literal previews. But they would have conveyed the essential truth. Something terrible was coming from the west. Something that would threaten not just the Targaryen dynasty, but the survival of human civilization itself. The directional aspect of this threat is particularly significant. Dragonstone sits at the eastern edge of Westeros, perfectly positioned to serve as an early warning system for dangers approaching from the west. From the Targaryens' perspective, Westeros itself was the west, the unknown lands beyond their island stronghold where strange peoples and ancient powers might lurk. If the prophetic visions showed destruction approaching from that direction, then the logical response would be to move into those western lands and prepare them to meet whatever was coming. The systematic nature of Aegon's conquest supports this interpretation. Rather than pursuing the gradual expansion that would be expected from purely territorial ambitions, Aegon moved with unprecedented speed and determination to bring as much of Westeros as possible under unified control. His terms for surrender were often surprisingly generous, suggesting that his primary goal was swift unification rather than punishment or subjugation of his enemies. This approach makes perfect sense if viewed as preparation for a larger conflict. Every month spent fighting individual kingdoms was time that could have been better used, preparing unified defenses against the real enemy. Aegon's willingness to accept submission rather than demanding total destruction of his opponents reflects the pragmatic understanding that he would need all of Westeros's strength intact to face whatever threat his visions had revealed. The specific nature of the prophesied threat becomes clearer when we consider what enemies would require the unified strength of an entire continent to defeat. The most obvious candidate is the return of the others, those ice demons from the far north whose last invasion had brought the Long Night and nearly destroyed human civilization 8,000 years earlier. The timing fits. Aegon's conquest occurred during a period when magic was beginning to stir again in the world, when the barriers holding ancient threats at bay might have been weakening. But the threat might have been even more specific than a general return of the others. Aegon's visions could have shown him the eventual emergence of the Night King, a specific individual who would unite the others under single leadership and direct them in a coordinated assault on the realms of men. Such a unified supernatural enemy would require an equally unified human response, making the political unification of Westeros not just advantageous, but essential for survival. The three-headed dragon that became the Targaryen sigil takes on new meaning in this context. Rather than simply representing the three dragons that Aegon and his sisters rode, it might symbolize the three-part strategy necessary to defeat the coming threat. Unified political authority, Aegon; military coordination, Visenya; and diplomatic integration, Rhaenys. Each head of the dragon served a different but complementary function in preparing Westeros for the war that was coming. Aegon's construction of the Iron Throne from the swords of defeated enemies becomes particularly symbolic. When viewed through this lens, the throne wasn't just a display of conquest, but a physical reminder that former enemies had been transformed into allies. Every sword in the throne represented a kingdom that was now part of the unified defense network, a potential enemy that had become a defender of the realm. The incomplete nature of Aegon's conquest, his failure to bring Dorne under Targaryen control, might reflect not military inadequacy, but prophetic understanding that Dorne would play a different role in the coming conflict. Perhaps his visions showed that the Southern Kingdom's independence would ultimately serve the greater cause, providing a refuge or alternative power center that would be crucial when the real war began. The tragic irony of this interpretation is that Aegon's success in unifying Westeros might have been too complete. By creating a powerful central authority and eliminating most regional conflicts, he established a period of relative peace that allowed subsequent generations to forget the threats his conquest was meant to address. The Targaryen dynasty became consumed with maintaining power rather than preparing for war, gradually losing sight of the original purpose that had driven their founders' campaigns. The dragons themselves take on different significance in this reading. Rather than simply being weapons of conquest, they were meant to be the ultimate defense against ice and darkness. Dragonfire was the one force proven capable of destroying others and their whites, making the preservation and expansion of the Targaryen dragon bond essential for humanity's survival. Each dragon that died in subsequent civil wars represented not just a loss of military power, but a reduction in the world's capacity to defend itself against the true enemy. The Dance of the Dragons, the civil war that decimated the Targaryen dragons, becomes especially tragic when viewed as the moment when humanity squandered the very weapons Aegon had preserved for their ultimate defense. The Iron Throne that was meant to unify the realm became the cause of its division, and the dragons that were meant to protect against ice and darkness died in flames lit by human ambition. This interpretation suggests that the current return of both dragons and others represents the convergence that Aegon foresaw, the moment when his preparations would finally be tested against the threat that had motivated them. Daenerys' dragons and the others' march south could be seen as the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, the beginning of the war that Aegon spent his life preparing Westeros to fight. But the realm that faces this threat is not the unified kingdom Aegon created. Centuries of civil war, political fragmentation, and the loss of most dragons have left Westeros far weaker than its founder intended. The very unity that was meant to be humanity's salvation has been fractured by the same human ambitions and conflicts that Aegon's conquest was meant to overcome. In this reading, Aegon the Conqueror emerges not as a power-hungry warlord, but as a prophetic guardian who sacrificed his own peaceful existence to forge the weapons humanity would need for its ultimate test. His conquest was not the beginning of Targaryen ambition, but the end of Targaryen isolation. The moment when the last dragon lords of Valyria accepted their responsibility to protect the world from threats that ordinary kingdoms could never hope to face alone. The question that remains is whether enough of Aegon's preparation survives to fulfill its intended purpose, or whether the centuries of human conflict have doomed his vision to failure just as the prophesied enemy finally emerges. From the north. Theory 16. The butterflies of Narth hide the most perfect defense system ever created, ancient peace magic that kills only invaders. In the peaceful waters of the summer sea, where trade winds carry the scent of exotic spices and unknown flowers, lies an island that embodies a paradox so perfect it seems impossible. Narth, homeland of Missandei and the gentle people known as the peaceful people or butterfly people, represents everything the rest of the world has forgotten how to be. Its inhabitants harm no living creature, refuse to take up arms even in their own defense, and have created a society based entirely on principles of non-violence and harmony with nature. Yet this island of absolute pacifism has remained unconquered for thousands of years, protected by a defense system so elegant and terrible that it makes the mightiest armies and strongest fortifications seem crude by comparison. The secret of Narth's protection lies not in walls or weapons, but in its most beautiful feature: the countless butterflies that dance through its warm air like living jewels. These creatures, with their delicate wings painted in every color imaginable, appear to be nothing more than harmless symbols of the island's natural beauty. But appearances deceive, for these butterflies carry within their fragile bodies a death so certain and horrible that it has deterred every attempt at conquest for millennia. They are the carriers of butterfly fever, a disease that affects only foreigners, causing their flesh to literally rot and slough away while they remain conscious and screaming until merciful death finally claims them. But this isn't a random quirk of evolution or an unfortunate biological accident. The precision with which the butterfly's disease targets only non-Narthi, the way it activates specifically when foreign armies attempt invasion, the perfect coordination between the insects and the island's defensive needs, all of this points to something far more sophisticated than natural selection. This is the work of ancient magic, a defensive system so perfectly designed that it represents perhaps the greatest achievement in the history of magical engineering. To understand how such a system could have been created, we must look back to the earliest days of Narthi civilization, when the island was first settled by people fleeing the violence and chaos of the wider world. These weren't ordinary refugees, but individuals gifted with deep magical understanding, practitioners of arts that focused not on domination and control but on harmony and protection. They might have been related to the children of the forest or learned from them, developing their own unique approach to magic that emphasized cooperation with nature rather than mastery over it. These ancient peace weavers faced a fundamental challenge: how to protect their vision of a non-violent society from a world that respected only strength and feared only superior force. Traditional defenses were out of the question. Walls and soldiers contradicted everything they believed in. And even if they could have brought themselves to build such things, they would never have been sufficient against the great powers of the ancient world. What they needed was something unprecedented, a defense that could protect without requiring the defenders to compromise their principles. The solution they developed was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of creating weapons to fight invaders, they transformed the island's very ecosystem into a selective barrier that could distinguish between those who belonged and those who represented threats. The butterflies, already present on the island and already beautiful symbols of peace and transformation, became the vectors for a magical plague that would activate only when hostile intentions were detected. This wasn't crude biological warfare, but something far more sophisticated, a form of magical programming that could read intent and respond accordingly. The butterflies don't simply carry a disease that kills foreigners. They carry a magical contagion that activates specifically when the foreign presence represents a threat to the island's peace. Traders, diplomats, and other peaceful visitors might experience mild discomfort or warning symptoms, but only those who come with conquest in their hearts face the full horror of butterfly fever. The magical nature of this defense system explains several aspects that would be impossible if it were merely biological. The disease's ability to distinguish between Nathi and foreigners, regardless of how long the foreigners have lived on the island, its activation only during attempted invasions rather than affecting every visitor, and most tellingly, its apparent intelligence in scaling its response to match the level of threat. All of these suggest a form of conscious magic rather than simple biological function. The butterflies themselves become magical creatures in this interpretation, though their magic is so subtle and perfectly integrated with their natural behavior that it's nearly invisible. They're not obviously supernatural like dragons or others, but they're imbued with just enough consciousness and purpose to serve as the sensory network for the island's defense system. Each butterfly becomes a tiny scout, monitoring the intentions and actions of everyone on the island and ready to activate the plague response when genuine threats are detected. The elegance of this system extends beyond its functionality to its moral implications. The Nathi never have to make the choice to kill their enemies. The island itself makes that decision, responding to hostile intent with consequences that match the threat. The defenders remain pure in their commitment to non-violence, while their home protects itself through means that operate entirely outside their conscious control. It's a perfect expression of the principle that violence breeds violence, but those who choose peace can find protection in ways that don't compromise their souls. The selection of butterflies as the vectors for this defense was itself symbolically perfect. Butterflies represent transformation, beauty, and the delicate balance of nature. Everything the Nathi value and everything their enemies typically destroy. To be killed by such creatures carries a kind of poetic justice that would be impossible to achieve through conventional warfare. Armies that come to the island expecting to face warriors instead find themselves defeated by the very symbols of what they're trying to destroy. The precision of the magical programming becomes even more impressive when we consider how it must function in practice. The system has to be able to distinguish between different types of foreign presence, scaling its response from mild warnings for peaceful visitors to lethal activation for serious threats. It has to monitor not just actions but intentions, detecting the difference between someone who might become hostile and someone who definitely will. Most remarkably, it has to maintain this vigilance continuously across centuries without degrading or making mistakes that would either harm innocent visitors or fail to protect against genuine threats. This suggests that the original Peace Weavers who created the system imbued it with a form of artificial intelligence. Not the crude mechanical thinking of later ages, but something more akin to the distributed consciousness we see in other magical systems like the Weirwood network. The butterflies might be connected through magical bonds that allow them to share information and coordinate responses, creating a collective intelligence that can make complex decisions about how to respond to different situations. The long-term stability of this system represents perhaps its most impressive achievement. For thousands of years, the butterfly defense has protected Nath without requiring maintenance, updates, or conscious direction from its creator's descendants. It has adapted to changing circumstances, new types of threats, and different technologies of warfare without losing its effectiveness or its moral precision. This represents a level of magical engineering that surpasses anything achieved by more famous civilizations like Valyria or the ancient empires of Essos. The implications for our understanding of magic itself are staggering. If the Nathi Peace Weavers could create such a perfect defensive system, what other applications might their approach to magic have enabled? Could they have developed magical solutions to problems like disease, famine, or natural disasters that plague other civilizations? Could their techniques for working with rather than against natural systems offer alternatives to the destructive magic practiced elsewhere in the world? Missandei's extraordinary intelligence and wisdom, so unusual for someone of her apparent age and background, might be the result of growing up in an environment suffused with this ancient peace magic. The same forces that protect the island might also enhance the intellectual and spiritual development of those who live in harmony with them, creating individuals capable of understanding and wisdom that seem almost supernatural to outsiders. The butterflies of Naath thus represent more than just a defense system. They're proof that magic can be used to enhance rather than diminish the moral fabric of civilization. They demonstrate that the choice between strength and virtue is a false one. That true protection comes not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from creating conditions where enmity itself becomes impossible to sustain. But perhaps most importantly, they show that the ultimate victory of peace over violence doesn't require converting or defeating those who choose violence. It simply requires making that choice self-defeating. The butterflies don't judge or punish invaders for their intentions. They simply ensure that those intentions cannot be successfully carried out. In doing so, they create a space where only peaceful purposes can flourish. A pocket of the world where the ancient dream of harmony between humanity and nature remains not just possible, but protected by forces that ensure its continuation. The butterflies of Naath dance on, beautiful and deadly, guardians of a dream that most of the world believes impossible, but which their very existence proves can be not only real, but perfectly defended. Theory 17. The Shrouded Lord is the last Valyrian. Sorcerer, trapped between life and death since the Doom. In the mist-shrouded ruins of the Sorrows, where the Rhoyne flows through the skeletal remains of once great cities, and the air itself seems poisoned with ancient grief. There rules a figure so mysterious that even his existence is debated by those who claim knowledge of the world's hidden corners. The Shrouded Lord, master of the Stone Men and king of the Greyscale Afflicted, is dismissed by some as mere legend, a bogeyman invented to frighten travelers away from dangerous waters. Others speak of him as a simple pirate or bandit chief who has claimed dominion over the diseased and desperate. But what if both explanations miss the terrible truth entirely? What if the Shrouded Lord is something far older and more tragic? The last surviving sorcerer of old Valyria, trapped in a state between life and death by a magical ritual that went catastrophically wrong during the Doom itself? To understand this possibility, we must first comprehend the true magnitude of what occurred when Valyria fell. This wasn't simply the destruction of a city or even an empire. It was the sudden, violent end of a civilization that had mastered magic in ways that the modern world can barely imagine. The Valyrian sorcerers didn't just use magic as a tool. They had fundamentally altered their own nature through centuries of magical practice, becoming something more and less than human in their pursuit of power over the fundamental forces of existence. When the Doom struck, these transformed beings faced annihilation not just of their bodies, but of their very essence. The magical energies that had sustained and empowered them for generations suddenly turned chaotic and destructive, unraveling the spells that held their enhanced forms together. Most would have died instantly, consumed by the same forces they had spent lifetimes learning to control. But a few might have attempted desperate measures to survive, working forbidden magic even as their world burned around them. The geographical location of the Sorrows provides crucial evidence for this theory. The Rhoyne river system was one of the primary routes connecting Valyria to its conquered territories, meaning that Valyrian sorcerers would have been present in the region during the Doom. More importantly, the Rhoynar themselves had their own magical traditions centered around water and river magic, creating a unique intersection of magical systems that might have provided opportunities for hybrid enchantments that would have been impossible elsewhere. A Valyrian sorcerer caught in this region during the Doom might have attempted to combine his own fire-based magic with local water magic in a desperate bid for survival. This forced fusion of incompatible magical systems could have created exactly the kind of catastrophic result that would explain the Shrouded Lord's current state, neither fully alive nor properly dead, sustained by corrupted magic that keeps his consciousness intact while slowly destroying his physical form. The nature of grayscale itself supports this interpretation. This isn't a simple disease, but a magical corruption that turns living flesh to stone, while somehow preserving enough biological function to keep the victim conscious and mobile. The precision required to create such an effect, maintaining neural activity while fundamentally altering cellular structure, suggests magical intervention rather than natural pathology. If a dying sorcerer attempted to preserve himself through transfiguration magic, grayscale could be the imperfect result of that desperate transformation. The Shrouded Lord's dominion over the Stone Men makes perfect sense in this context. As the source of the magical corruption that creates grayscale, he would naturally command authority over those afflicted with the condition. They're not just his subjects, but extensions of his own magically altered existence, connected to him through the same corrupted energies that sustain them all. His kingdom in the Sorrows isn't a territory claimed through conquest, but a manifestation of his magical presence, an area where his influence is strong enough to maintain the complex spells, keeping him and his followers in their twilight state, between life and death. The perpetual mists that shroud the Sorrows could be another manifestation of the failed preservation ritual. Water magic typically involves manipulation of atmospheric moisture, and a catastrophically damaged spell might continue generating endless fog as a side effect of its disrupted function. The mists serve multiple purposes in this interpretation. They hide the true nature of what dwells within them. They create the perfect environment for grayscale to spread, and they might actually be necessary for maintaining the magical ecosystem that keeps the Shrouded Lord's kingdom stable. The timing of the doom and the establishment of the Shrouded Lord's reign aligns perfectly with this theory. Historical accounts suggest that the Sorrows became a place of dread and disease within decades of Valeria's fall, exactly when a surviving sorcerer would have been establishing his cursed domain. The rapid spread of grayscale in the region and the equally rapid abandonment of major cities along the Rhoyne point to a sudden magical catastrophe rather than a gradual plague or natural disaster. The Shrouded Lord's apparent immortality becomes explicable as the result of a preservation spell that succeeded too well in some ways and failed catastrophically in others. Instead of achieving the eternal life and perfect health that Valyrian sorcerers often sought, the ritual created a state of eternal decay. Consciousness preserved in a body that constantly dies but cannot achieve the release of actual death. He exists in perfect torment, aware of what he has become but unable to either reverse the transformation or complete it. The physical descriptions of encounters with the Shrouded Lord, rare and contradictory as they are, consistently emphasize his concealment behind wrappings and veils. This could be simple practical necessity. His transformed state might be so horrifying that looking upon his true form would drive observers mad, or instantly transmit grayscale through visual contact. Alternatively, the shrouds might be magically necessary, serving as containment for magical energies that would otherwise dissipate and end his existence entirely. The connection between the Shrouded Lord and Prince Garin's legendary curse on the Valyrian conquerors provides another layer of evidence. Garin called upon the Mother Rhoyne to drown the dragons and their riders, and while this curse was initially interpreted as a reference to literal drowning, it could actually have been the magical framework that made the sorcerer's later transformation possible. The drowning might refer not to water, but to the overwhelming flood of corrupted magical energy that would eventually trap the future Shrouded Lord in his current state. This interpretation transforms the Shrouded Lord from a mere monster or criminal into a figure of genuine tragedy. the last witness to Valyria's greatness and the final victim of its hubris. He represents the ultimate fate of those who seek to transcend human limitations through magic, not the godlike power they desire, but a cursed existence that combines the worst aspects of mortality and immortality without the benefits of either. His continued existence serves as a warning about the dangers of magical overreach, but it also represents an unprecedented repository of knowledge about old Valyrian sorcery. If someone could find a way to communicate with him safely, or better yet, find a way to lift his curse without destroying him entirely, the magical knowledge he possesses could revolutionize understanding of forces that shaped the ancient world. But perhaps most tragically, the Shrouded Lord might be fully aware of what he has become and what he has lost. He could remember the glory of old Valyria, the power he once wielded, the life he sacrificed in his desperate attempt to survive the doom. His rule over the Stone Men might be motivated not by malice, but by loneliness, surrounding himself with others who share his cursed state because they're the only ones who can understand the nature of his existence. The sorrows in this reading become more than just a place of disease and decay. They're a monument to ambition punished and a preservation of magical knowledge that exists nowhere else in the world. The Shrouded Lord stands at the center of it all, neither alive nor dead, neither human nor monster, but something that transcends and mocks both categories. The final achievement and ultimate failure of Valyrian magical ambition made manifest in a single, eternally suffering figure who rules over a kingdom of living stone in the ruins of his civilization's greatness. Theory 18. The Blackfire Conspiracy goes deeper than anyone imagined. How Varys and Illyrio plan to finally claim the Iron Throne. In the shadowed halls of power where whispers carry more weight than swords and information flows like poison through the veins of the realm, two men have been playing a game so complex and long-term that its true scope has remained hidden even from those who believe themselves masters of political intrigue. Varys the Spider, eunuch spymaster to kings, and Illyrio Mopatis, wealthy magister of Pentos, present themselves as unlikely allies brought together by mutual advantage and shared goals. But what if their partnership runs far deeper than anyone suspects? What if these two men are bound not just by political convenience, but by blood, heritage, and a multi-generational conspiracy to restore the Blackfire line to the Iron Throne through deception so masterful that even their enemies will help them achieve victory? The key to understanding this vast conspiracy lies in recognizing that the Blackfire pretenders never truly died out, despite the conventional wisdom that holds their male line extinct with the death of Maelys the Monstrous. Like all great noble houses, the Blackfires understood that survival sometimes requires strategic retreat and reinvention. When direct military confrontation failed repeatedly, the surviving members of the line adapted, abandoning the futile path of open rebellion in favor of infiltration, manipulation, and patient preparation for the moment when they could reclaim their heritage through guile rather than force. Varys himself represents the first crucial element of this hidden survival strategy. His mysterious origins, his inexplicable rise to power despite lacking the traditional qualifications for high office, and most tellingly, his unwavering commitment to principles that seem to transcend mere professional duty. All of these suggest motivations more personal than the simple desire for influence or wealth. If Varys carries Blackfire blood, possibly as a descendant of a female line that escaped the purges following the failed rebellions, his entire career takes on new meaning as a decades-long infiltration of the very power structure his family was excluded from. The geographic pattern of Varys's early life supports this interpretation. His childhood in the Free Cities, particularly Lys, where he was supposedly born, places him in exactly the regions where Blackfire refugees would have fled following their defeats. The Free Cities had long histories of harboring exiled Westerosi nobles, and a Blackfire remnant would have found natural sanctuary among merchants and magisters who had their own reasons for opposing Targaryen power. Illyrio Mopatis represents the second crucial element, the financial and logistical infrastructure necessary to support such an ambitious, long-term conspiracy. But Illyrio's role extends far beyond simply providing resources. His marriage to Serra, the mysterious woman with distinctly Valyrian features who died before the events of the main story, provides the genetic component necessary to create a plausible Targaryen pretender who actually carries Blackfire blood. Serra's description: silver gold hair, purple eyes, and hints of noble bearing despite her apparent status as a former slave, fits perfectly with a woman from a hidden Blackfire line. Her marriage to Illyrio wasn't a simple love match, but a carefully arranged union designed to combine resources, bloodlines, and political positioning. If Serra was indeed a female-line Blackfire descendant, then her son with Illyrio would carry legitimate claims to Targaryen heritage while actually representing the restoration of the rival branch. Young Griff, presented to the world as Aegon Targaryen, son of Prince Rhaegar and Elia Martell, becomes the perfect culmination of this conspiracy. Rather than being the miraculously saved infant prince that Jon Connington believes him to be, he's actually Illyrio and Serra's son, a child who genuinely possesses Targaryen blood through his Blackfire mother, but who has been raised and trained specifically to fulfill the role of Targaryen restoration. His physical appearance, so remarkably similar to the traditional Targaryen look, comes not from being Rhaegar's son, but from inheriting his mother's Blackfire features. The beauty of this deception lies in its fundamental truthfulness. Young Griff isn't a complete imposter. He actually does carry Targaryen blood, just not from the line that his supporters believe. When he displays the silver hair and purple eyes that mark him as a dragon's heir, when he shows aptitude for leadership and tactical thinking, when he demonstrates the kind of natural charisma that made his supposed father so beloved, all of these traits are genuine, inherited from ancestors who were indeed Targaryens, just not the specific Targaryens his story claims. The involvement of the Golden Company provides the final piece of evidence for this theory. This legendary sellsword company was founded by Igor Bittersteel Rivers, one of the Great Bastards and Demon Blackfire's most loyal supporter. For centuries, the Golden Company had been the military arm of Blackfire ambitions, supporting every major rebellion and maintaining their loyalty to the cause even after the supposed extinction of the line. Their current decision to break their contract and support young Griff's invasion represents the first time in their history they've supported a Targaryen claimant. This unprecedented shift only makes sense if the Golden Company's leadership knows something that others don't, that young Griff isn't actually a Targaryen at all, but the long-awaited Blackfire restoration they've been waiting for. Their willingness to stake their legendary reputation on this campaign suggests they've been given proof of young Griff's true parentage and understand that this represents the culmination of everything their company was founded to achieve. The timeline of the conspiracy supports this interpretation perfectly. Varys' rise to power, Illyrio's accumulation of wealth and influence, Serra's strategic marriage and the birth of young Griff, the careful cultivation of Jon Connington's loyalty through manufactured evidence of the boy's identity. All of these elements required decades of patient preparation and coordination between multiple actors working toward a shared goal. But the true genius of the plan lies in how it turns the established power structures of Westeros against themselves. By presenting young Griff as a Targaryen restoration, the conspirators ensure that their Blackfire pretender will receive support from all the forces that oppose the current regime. Lords who would never knowingly support a Blackfire will rally to what they believe is the rightful Targaryen heir, providing the military and political support necessary for the conspiracy's success. Even more cleverly, the plan doesn't require the conspirators to reveal young Griff's true parentage until after he's already secured the throne. Once he's established as king, the revelation that he carries Blackfire blood becomes irrelevant. He'll have achieved legitimacy through conquest and popular support, making his specific genealogy a matter of historical interest rather than political importance. The psychological manipulation involved in this conspiracy reaches remarkable depths. John Connington, that loyal knight who loved Prince Rhaegar and blamed himself for failing to protect the royal family, becomes the perfect unwitting advocate for the Blackfire cause. His genuine grief and determination to redeem himself by protecting Aegon provides exactly the kind of authentic emotional commitment that can't be faked or bought. Daenerys Targaryen herself might ultimately become another tool in the conspiracy's success. If she proves too independent or idealistic to serve Varys and Illyrio's purposes, young Griff's existence as an alternative Targaryen claimant gives them leverage to undermine her position. If she proves useful, his presence as a potential marriage partner allows them to unite different factions under a single banner while maintaining control through their hidden influence over the male heir. The irony is perfect and brutal. The Blackfire line, defeated in every direct confrontation with their Targaryen cousins, may finally achieve victory by convincing their enemies to restore them to power willingly. The very people who destroyed the Blackfire rebellions will become the instruments of Blackfire restoration, believing themselves to be supporting the rightful dynasty while actually enabling the triumph of its greatest rivals. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this conspiracy is what it reveals about the nature of power and legitimacy in Westeros. If young Griff can successfully claim the Iron Throne while hiding his true parentage, it demonstrates that royal blood and ancient claims matter far less than political skill and popular support. The Game of Thrones becomes not a contest between legitimate and illegitimate claimants, but a test of who can most effectively manipulate the symbols and stories that people use to justify their loyalty. In the end, the Blackfire conspiracy represents the ultimate evolution of political ambition. A plan so sophisticated that it transforms defeat into victory, exile into infiltration, and rebellion into restoration. Varys and Illyrio haven't just been playing the Game of Thrones. They've been rewriting its rules entirely, creating a scenario where their victory becomes inevitable because their enemies never realize they're fighting the wrong war entirely. The dragon has 3 heads, as Targaryen prophecy declares. But what if one of those heads was never a dragon at all, but a different creature entirely that learned to wear dragon's colors so perfectly that even dragons themselves couldn't tell the difference? These 18 theories, drawn from the deepest mysteries and most carefully hidden secrets of Westeros and Essos, reveal a world far more complex and interconnected than the surface narratives suggest. From the ancient betrayal that may have triggered the Long Night, to the ongoing conspiracy that could place a secret Blackfire on the Iron Throne, every major event in the history of the known world carries hidden meanings and secret purposes that transform our understanding of power, magic, and the very nature of civilization itself. The pattern that emerges from these revelations is one of cycles within cycles, where ancient crimes echo through millennia and forgotten powers continue to shape events from the shadows. The others aren't simple monsters but guardians of lost bloodlines. The greatest empires fall not to external enemies but to the consequences of their own moral failures. The most honored institutions preserve their deepest secrets through absolute silence, and the most devastating prophecies fulfill themselves through the very attempts to prevent them. Perhaps most importantly, these theories reveal that in the world of ice and fire, nothing is ever truly lost. Bloodlines thought extinct continue in hidden forms, magical traditions survive in unexpected places, and the consequences of choices made thousands of years ago continue to ripple through the present. The Game of Thrones is not just a contest for political power, but a vast, unconscious collaboration between the living and the dead, the magical and the mundane, the seen and the unseen. The true song of Ice and Fire may not be about the conflict between opposing forces, but about the recognition that all forces, no matter how opposed they seem, are part of a larger pattern that encompasses and transcends them all. In the end, the hidden truths of this world suggest that understanding comes not from choosing sides, but from recognizing that every side contains elements of a greater truth that can only be seen when all the pieces are finally assembled. The game continues, but now we can see more of the board than ever before.